It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Welcome to this latest Stories Told in the Pouring Rain video. Tonight we have a mixture of previously unrecorded stuff and some old classics mixed in. Now the aim of this video is to help you get off to a relaxing night's sleep, so the rainstorm sounds are mixed quite high. And before we get to the stories, I want to do a little something to help you get relaxed and in the mood. This is known as the body scan meditation. Now, I want you to try this. Feel your feet on the ground right now. In your shoes or without, it doesn't really matter. Now I want you to track or scan over your whole body, bit by bit, very slowly, all the way up to the crown of your head. The point of this practice is to check in with your whole body, from fingertips to shoulders, from your butt to your big toe. Now, there are no rules to this, no judging, no wondering, and no worrying. Just check in with the physical feeling of being in your body. Any aches and pains you have are fine. You don't have to do anything about anything right now. All you're doing is noticing. Now I want you to begin to focus your attention on different parts of your body. You can choose one particular area or go through a sequence like this. Your toes, your feet, the sole, the heel, the top of the foot, through the legs to the pelvis, the abdomen, lower back, upper back, chest and shoulders, your arms all the way down to the fingers, and the shoulders, the neck, different parts of your face and your head. For each part of the body, I want you to linger for a few moments and notice the different sensations as you're focusing. Now, the moment you notice that your mind's wandered, return your attention to the part of the body you last remember. Now, if you find yourself falling asleep already, that's okay. When you realize you've been nodding off, take a deep breath to help you reawaken if you want, or perhaps just go to sleep. When you're ready, return your attention back to the part of the body you last remember focusing on, and continue. For those of you not asleep already, welcome to 4 hours of stories told in the pouring rain. And we begin with The Haunted Burglar. Anthony Ross doubtless had the oddest and most complex temperament that ever assured the success of burglary as a business. This fact is mentioned in order that those who choose may employ it as an explanation of the extraordinary ideas that entered his head and gave a strangely tragic character to his career. Though ignorant, the man had an uncommonly fine mind in certain aspects. Thus it happened that, while lacking moral perception, he cherished an artistic pride in the smooth, elegant, and finished conduct of his work. Hence a blunder on his part invariably filled him with grief and humiliation, and it was the steadily increasing recurrence of these errors that finally impelled him to make a deliberate analysis of his case. Among the stupid acts with which he charged himself was the murder of the banker Uriah Matson, a feeble old man whom a simple choking or a sufficient tap on the skull would have rendered helpless. Instead of that, he had choked his victim to death in the most brutal and unnecessary manner, and in doing so had used the fingers of his left hand in a singularly sprawled and awkward fashion. The whole act was utterly unlike him. It appalled him and horrified him, not for the sin of taking human life, but because it was unnecessary, dangerous, subversive of the principles of skilled burglary, and monstrously inartistic. A similar mishap had occurred in the case of Miss Jellison, a wealthy spinster, merely because she was in the act of waking, which meant an ensuing scream. In this case, as in the other, he was unspeakably shocked to discover that the fatal choking had been done by the left hand, with sprawled and awkward fingers, and with a savage ferocity entirely uncalled for by his peril. In setting himself to analyze these incongruous and revolting things, he dragged forth from his memory numerous other acts, unlike those two in detail, but similar to them in spirit. Thus, in a fit of passionate anger, the whimpering of an infant, he had flung it brutally against the wall. Another time he was nearly discovered through the needless torturing of a cat, whose cries set pursuers at his heels. These and other insane, inartistic and ferocious acts he arrayed for serious analysis. Finally, the realization burst upon him that all his aberrations of conduct had proceeded from his left hand and arm. Search his recollection ever so diligently, he could not recall a single instance wherein his right hand had failed to proceed on perfectly fine, sure, and artistic lines. When he made this discovery, he realized that he had brought himself face to face with a terrifying mystery, and its horrors were increased when he reflected that, while his left hand had committed acts of stupid atrocity in the pursuit of his burglarious enterprises, on many occasions when he was not so engaged, it had acted with a less harmful but a less coarse, irrational, and inartistic purpose. It was not difficult for such a man to arrive at strange conclusions. The explanation that promptly suggested itself, and that his coolest and shrewdest wisdom could not shake, was that his left hand was under the dominion of a perverse and malicious spirit, that it was an entity apart from his own spirit, and that it had fastened itself upon that part of his body to produce his ruin. It was useless, however, inviting to speculate upon the order of mind capable of arriving at such a conclusion. It is more to the point to narrate the terrible happenings to which it gave rise. About a month after the burglar's mental struggle, a strange-looking man applied for a situation at a sawmill 100 miles away. His appearance was exceedingly distressing. Either a grievous bodily illness or fearful mental anguish had made his face wan and haggard, and filled his eyes with the light of a hard desperation that gave promise of dire results. There were no marks of a vagabond on his clothing or in his manner. He didn't seem to be suffering for physical necessities. He held his head aloft and walked like a man, and an understanding glance would have seen that his look of determination meant something profounder and more far-reaching than the ordinary business concerns of life. He gave the name of Hope. His manner was so engaging, yet withal so firm and abstracted, that he secured a position without difficulty, and so faithfully did he work, and so quick was his intelligence, that in good time his request to be given the management of a saw was granted. It might have been noticed that his face thereupon wore a deeper and more haggard look, but that its rigours were softened by a light of happy expectancy. As he cultivated no friendships among the men, he had no confidants. He went his dark way alone to the end. He seemed to take more than the pleasure of an efficient workman in observing the products of his skill. He would stealthily hug the big brown logs as they approached the saw, and his eyes were ablaze when the great tool went singing and roaring at its work. The foreman, mistaking this eagerness for carelessness, quietly cautioned him to beware. But when the next log was mounted for the saw, the stranger appeared to slip and fall. He clasped the moving log in his arms, and the next moment the insatiable teeth had severed his left arm near the shoulder, and the stranger sank with a groan into the soft sawdust that filled the pit. There was the usual commotion attending such accidents, for the faces of the workmen turn white when they see one of their number was maimed for life. But Hope received good surgical care, and in due time was able to be abroad. Then the men observed that a remarkable change had come over him. His moroseness had disappeared, and in its stead was a hearty cheer of manner that amazed them. Was the losing of a precious arm a thing to make a wretched man happy? Hope was given light work in the office, and might have remained to the end of his days a competent and prosperous man. But one day he left, and was never seen thereabout again. Then Anthony Ross, the burglar, reappeared on the scenes of his former exploits. The police were dismayed to note the arrival of a man whom all their skill had been unable to convict of terrible crimes which they were certain he had committed, and they questioned him about the loss of his arm, but he laughed them away with the fine sang-froid with which they were familiar, and soon his handiwork appeared in reports of daring burglaries. A watch of extraordinary care and minuteness was set upon him, but that availed nothing until a singular thing occurred to baffle the officers beyond measure. Ross had suddenly become wildly reckless and walked red-handed into the mouth of the law. By evidence that seemed indisputable, a burglary and atrocious murder were traced to him. Stranger than all else, he made no effort to escape, though leaving a hanging trail behind him. When the officers overhauled him, they found him in a state of utter dejection, wholly different from the light-hearted bearing that had characterized him ever since he'd returned without his left arm. Neither admitting nor denying his guilt, he bore himself with the hopelessness of a man already condemned to the gallows. Even when he was brought before a jury and placed on trial, he made no fight for his life. Although possessed of abundant means, he refused to employ an attorney and treated with scant courtesy the one assigned him by the judge. He betrayed irritation at the slow dragging of the case as the prosecution piled up his evidence against him. His whole manner indicated that he wished the trial to end as soon as possible and hoped for a verdict of guilty. This incomprehensible behavior placed the voting and ambitious attorney on his mettle. He realized that some inexplicable mystery lay behind the matter, and this sharpened the zeal to find it. He plied his client with all manner of questions and tried in all ways to secure his confidence. Ross remained sullen, morose, and wholly given over to despairing resignation. The young lawyer had made a wonderful discovery, which he at first felt confident would clear the prisoner, but any mention of it to Ross would only throw him into a violent passion and cause him to tremble as with palsy. His conduct on such occasions was terrible beyond measure. He seemed utterly beside himself, and thus his attorney had become convinced of the man's insanity. The trouble in proving it was that he dared not mention his discovery to others, and that Ross exhibited no signs of mania unless that one subject was broached. The prosecution made out a case that looked impregnable, and this fact seemed to fill the prisoner with peace. The young lawyer for the defense had summoned a number of witnesses, but in the end he used only one. His opening statement to the jury was merely that it was a physical impossibility for the prisoner to have committed the murder, which was done by choking. Ross made a frantic attempt to stop him from putting forth that defense, and from the dock wildly denounced it as a lie. The young lawyer nevertheless proceeded with what he deemed his duty to his unwilling client. He called a photographer and had him produce a large picture of the murdered man's face and neck. It proved that the portrait was that of the person whom Ross was charged with having killed. As he approached the climax of the scene, Ross became entirely ungovernable in his frantic efforts to stop the introduction of the evidence, and so it became necessary to bind and gag him and strap him to the chair. When quiet was restored, the lawyer handed the photograph to the jury and quietly remarked, "You may see for yourselves that the choking was done with the left hand, and you have observed that my client has no such member." He was unmistakably right. The imprint of the thumb and fingers, forced into the flesh in a singularly ferocious, sprawling and awkward manner, was shown in the photograph with absolute clearness. The prosecution, taken wholly by surprise, blustered and made attempts to assail the evidence, but without success. The jury returned with a verdict of not guilty. Meanwhile, the prisoner had fainted, and his gag and bonds had been removed, but he recovered at the moment when the verdict was announced. He staggered to his feet, and his eyes rolled. Then, with a thick tongue, he exclaimed, "It was the left arm that did it. This one," holding his right arm as high as he could reach. "This one never made a mistake. It was always the left one. Spirit of mischief and murder was in it. I cut it off in a sawmill, but the spirit stayed where the arm used to be, and it choked this man to death. I didn't want you to acquit me. I wanted you to hang me. I can't go through life having this thing haunting me and spoiling my business and making a murderer of me. It tries to choke me while I sleep. There it is. Can't you see it?" He looked with wide staring eyes at his left side. "Mr. Sheriff," the judge said gravely, "take this man before the commissioners of lunacy tomorrow." Across the moors. It really was most unfortunate. Peggy had a temperature of nearly 100 and a pain in her side, and Mrs. Workington Bancroft knew that it was appendicitis. But there was no one whom she could send for the doctor. James had gone with the jaunting car to meet her husband, who had at last managed to get away for a week's shooting. Adolphe she'd sent to the Evershams only half an hour before, with a note for Lady Eva. The cook could not manage to walk, even if dinner could be served without her. Kate, as usual, was not to be trusted. And there remained Miss Craig. "Of course, you must see that Peggy is really ill," said she, as the governess came into the room in answer to her summons. "The difficulty is that there is absolutely no one whom I can send for the doctor." Mrs. Workington Bancroft paused. She was always willing that those beneath her should have the privilege of offering the services which it was her right to command. "So, perhaps, Miss Craig," she went on, "you wouldn't mind walking over to Tebbit's farm. I hear there's a Liverpool doctor staying there. Of course I know nothing about him, but we must take the risk, and I expect he'll be only too glad to be earning something during his holiday. It's nearly 4 miles away, I know, and I'd never dream of asking you, if it was not that I dread appendicitis so." "Very well," said Miss Craig. "I suppose I must go, but I don't know the way." "Oh, you can't miss it," said Mrs. Workington Bancroft, in her anxiety temporarily forgiving the obvious unwillingness of her governess's consent. "You follow the road across the moor for 2 miles, until you come to Redman's Cross. You turn to the left there, and follow a rough path that leads through a large plantation, and Tebbit's farm lies just below you in the valley. Oh, and take Pontiff with you," she added, as the girl left the room. "There's absolutely nothing to be afraid of, but I expect you'll feel happier with the dog." "Well, miss," said the cook, when Miss Craig went into the kitchen to get her boots, which had been drying by the fire. "Of course she knows best, but I don't think it's right that, after all that's happened, for the mistress to send you across the moors on a night like this. It's not as if the doctor could do anything for Miss Margaret if you do bring it. Every child is like that once in a while. He'll only say, 'Put her to bed,' and she's there already." "Oh, I don't see what there is to be afraid of, cook," said Miss Craig as she laced her boots, "unless you believe in ghosts." "Oh, I'm not so sure about that. Anyhow, I don't like sleeping in a bed where the sheets are too short for you to pull them over your head. But don't you be frightened, miss. It's my belief that their bark is worse than their bite." But though Miss Craig amused herself for some minutes by trying to imagine the bark of a ghost, a thing altogether different from the classical ghostly bark, she didn't feel entirely at ease. She was naturally nervous, and living as she did in the hinterland of the servants' hall, she'd heard vague details of true stories that were only myths in the drawing-room. The very name of Redman's Cross sent a shiver through her. It must have been the place where that horrid murder was committed. She'd forgotten the tale, though she remembered the name. Her first disaster came soon enough. Pontiff, who was naturally slow-witted, took more than 5 minutes to find out that it was only the governess he was escorting. But once the discovery had been made, he promptly turned tail, paying not the slightest heed to Miss Craig's feeble whistle. And then, to add to her discomfort, the rain came, not in heavy drops, but driving in sheets of thin spray that blotted out what few landmarks there were upon the moor. They were very kind at Tebbit's farm. The doctor had gone back to Liverpool the day before, but Mrs. Tebbit gave her hot milk and turf cakes, and had ordered her reluctant son to show Miss Craig a shorter path onto the moor, one that avoided the larch wood. Oh, he was a monosyllabic youth, but his presence was cheering, and she felt the night doubly black when he left her at the last gate. She trudged on wearily. Her thoughts had already gone back to the almost exhausted theme of the bark of ghosts, when she heard steps on the road behind her that were at least material. Next minute the figure of a man appeared. Miss Craig was relieved to see that the stranger was a clergyman. He raised his hat. "Oh, I believe we're both going in the same direction," he said. "Perhaps I may have the pleasure of escorting you." She thanked him. "It is rather weird at night," she went on, "and what with all the tales of ghosts and bogies that one hears from the country people, I've ended by being half afraid myself." "Oh, I can understand your nervousness," he said, "especially on a night like this. I used to, at one time, feel the same, for my work often meant lonely walks across the moor to farms which were only reached by rough tracks, difficult enough to find even in the daytime." "And you never saw anything to frighten you? Nothing immaterial, I mean?" "I can't really say that I did. But I had an experience 11 years ago which served as a turning point in my life. And since you seem to be now in much the same state of mind I was then, I'll tell you. The time of year was late September. I'd been over to Westendale to see an old woman who was dying, and then, just as I was about to start on my way home, word came to me of another of my parishioners who'd been suddenly taken ill only that morning. It was after 7 when at last I started. A farmer saw me on the way, turning back when I reached the moor road. The sunset the previous evening had been one of the most lovely I ever remember seeing. The whole vault of heaven had been scattered with flakes of white cloud, tipped with rosy pink like the strewn petals of a full-blown rose. But that night, all was changed. The sky was an absolutely dull slate color, except in one corner of the west where a thin rift showed the last saffron tint of the sullen sunset. As I walked, stiff and footsore, my spirits sank. It must have been the marked contrast between the 2 evenings, the one so lovely, so full of promise. The corn was still out in the fields, spoiling for fine weather, and the other so gloomy, so sad with all the dead weight of autumn and winter days to come. And then added to this sense of heavy depression came another different feeling, which I surprised myself by recognizing as fear. I do not know why I was afraid. The moors lay on either side of me, unbroken except for a straggling line of turf shooting butts that stood within a stone's throw of the road. The only sound I heard for the last half hour was the cry of the startled grouse. Go back, go back, go back. But yet the feeling of fear was there, affecting a low center of my brain through some little-used physical channel. I buttoned my coat closer and tried to divert my thoughts by thinking of next Sunday's sermon. I had chosen to preach on Job. There's much in the old-fashioned notion of the book, apart from all the subtleties of the higher criticism, that appeals to country people. The loss of herds and crops, the breakup of the family. I would not have dared to speak had not I too been a farmer. My own glebe land had been flooded 3 weeks before, and I suppose I stood to lose as much as any man in the parish. As I walked along the road, repeating to myself the first chapter of the book, I stopped at the 12th verse. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Now the thought of the bad harvest, and that is an awful thought in these valleys, vanished. I seemed to gaze into an ocean of infinite darkness. Now I'd often use, with the Sunday glibness of the tired priest, whose duty it is to preach 3 sermons in one day, the old simile of the chessboard. God and the devil were the players, and we were helping one side or the other. But until that night I'd not thought of the possibility of my being only a pawn in the game, that God might throw away, that the game might be won. Well, I'd reached the place where we are now. I remember it by that rough stone water trough, when a man suddenly jumped out from the roadside. He'd been seated on a heap of broken road metal. Which way are you going, governor?" he said. I knew from the way he spoke that the man was a stranger. There are many at this time of the year who come from the south, trampling northwards with the ripening corn. I told him my destination. "We will go along together," he replied. It was too dark to see much of the man's face, but what little I made out was coarse and brutal. Then he began the half-menacing whine I know so well. He'd trampled miles that day. He'd had no food since breakfast, and that was only a crust. "Oh, give us a copper," he said. "It's only for a night's lodging." Well, he was whittling away with a big clasp knife at an ash stake he'd taken from some hedge. The clergyman broke off. "Oh, are those the lights of your house?" he said. "We're nearer than I expected, but I shall have time to finish my story. I think I will, for you can run home in a couple of minutes, and I don't want you to be frightened when you're out on the moors again." So, as the man talked, he seemed to have stepped out of the very background of my thoughts. His sordid tale, with the sad lies that hid a far sadder truth. He asked me the time. It was 5 minutes to 9. As I replaced my watch, I glanced at his face. His teeth were clenched, and there was something in the gleam of his eyes that told me at once his purpose. Now, have you ever known how long a second is? For a third of a second, I stood there facing him, filled with an overwhelming pity for myself and him. And then, without a word of warning, he was upon me. I felt nothing. A flash of lightning ran down my spine. I heard the dull crash of the ash stake, and then a very gentle patter like the sound of a far-distant stream. For a minute I lay in perfect happiness, watching the lights of the house as they increased in number, until the whole heaven shone with twinkling lamps. I could not have had a more painless death. Miss Gregg looked up. The man was gone. She was alone on the moor. She ran to the house, her teeth chattering, ran to the solid shadow that crossed and recrossed the kitchen blind. She entered the hall. The clock on the stairs struck the hour. It was 9 o'clock.
It's the material, said the old ship's doctor. The material plus the conditions and, maybe, he added slowly, a third factor. Yes, a third factor, but they're...
He broke off his half-meditative sentence and began to charge his pipe.
Go on, Doctor,
we said encouragingly, and with more than a little expectancy. We were in the smoke room of the Sandelay, running across the North Atlantic, and the doctor was a character. He concluded the charging of his pipe and lit it, and then settled himself, and began to express himself more fully.
The material, he said with conviction, is inevitably the medium of expression of the life force, the fulcrum, as it were, lacking which it is unable to exert itself or indeed to express itself in any form or fashion that would be intelligible or evident to us. So potent is the share of the material in the production of that thing which we name life, and so eager the life force to express itself, that I'm convinced it would, if given the right conditions, make itself manifest even through so hopeless seeming a medium as a simple block of sawn wood. For I tell you, gentlemen, the life force is both as fiercely urgent and as indiscriminate as fire, the destructor, yet which some are now growing to consider the very essence of life rampant. There's a quaint seeming paradox there, he concluded, nodding his old grey head. Yes, Doctor, I said. In brief, your argument is that life is a thing, state, fact, or element, call it what you like, which requires the material through which to manifest itself, and that given the material plus the conditions, the result is life. In other words, that life is an evolved product, manifested through matter and bred of conditions, eh? As we understand the word, said the old doctor. Though, mind you, there may be a third factor. But, in my heart, I believe that it's a matter of chemistry, conditions in a suitable medium. But given the conditions, the brute is so almighty that it will seize upon anything through which to manifest itself. It is a force generated by conditions, but nevertheless this does not bring us one iota nearer to its explanation, any more than to the explanation of electricity or fire. They are, all three, of the outer forces, monsters of the void. Nothing we can do will create any one of them. Our power is merely to be able, by providing the conditions, to make each one of them manifest to our physical senses. Am I clear? Yes, Doctor. In a way you are, I said. But I don't agree with you, though I think I understand you. Electricity and fire are both what I call natural things, but life is an abstract something, a kind of all-permeating wakefulness. Oh, I can't explain it. Who could?
but it is spiritual, not just a thing bred out of a condition like fire, as you say, or electricity. It is a horrible thought of yours. Life's a kind of spiritual mystery.
Ah, easy, my boy,
said the old doctor, laughing gently to himself.
Or else I may be asking you to demonstrate the spiritual mystery of life, of the limpet or the crab, shall we say.
He grinned at me with ineffable perverseness.
Anyway, he continued, as I suppose you've all guessed, I've a yarn to tell you in support of my impression that life is no more a mystery or a miracle than fire or electricity. But please to remember, gentlemen, that because we've succeeded in naming and making good use of these two forces, they are just as much mysteries, fundamentally now, as ever. And, anyway, the thing I'm going to tell you won't explain the mystery of life, but only give you one of my pegs on which I hang my feeling that life is, as I've said, a force made manifest through conditions. That is to say, natural chemistry, and that it can take for its purpose and need the most incredible and unlikely matter. For without matter it cannot come into existence. It cannot become manifest. Oh, I don't agree with you, Doctor, I interrupted. Your theory would destroy all belief in life after death. It would... Hush, Sonny, said the old man with a quiet little smile of comprehension. Hark to what I have to say first, and anyway, what objection have you to material life after death? And if you object to a material framework, I would still have you remember that I am speaking of life, as we understand the word in this, our life. Now do be quiet, lad, or I'll never be done. Well, it was when I was a young man, and that's a good many years ago, gentlemen. I passed my examinations, but was so run down with overwork that it was decided that I'd better take a trip to sea. I was by no means well off, and very glad in the end to secure a nominal post as doctor in the sailing passenger clipper running out to China. The name of the ship was Beopse, and soon after I got all my gear aboard, she cast off, and we dropped down the Thames, and next day we were well out in the Channel. The captain's name was Gannington, a very decent man, though quite illiterate. The first mate, Mr. Burlees, was a quiet, sternish reserve man, very well read. The second mate, Mr. Selvern, was, perhaps by birth and upbringing, the most socially cultured of the three, but he lacked the stamina and indomitable pluck of the other two. He was more of a sensitive and, emotionally and even mentally, the most alert man of the three. On our way out, we called at Madagascar, where we landed some of our passengers. Then we ran eastward, meaning to call at Northwest Cape, but about 100 degrees east, we encountered very dreadful weather, which carried away all our sails and sprung the jibboom and the forward-gallant mast. Well, the storm carried us northward for several hundred miles, and when it dropped us finally, we found ourselves in a very bad state. The ship had been strained, and had taken some 3 feet of water through her seams. The main topmast had been sprung, in addition to the jibboom and the forward-gallant mast. 2 of our boats had gone, as also one of the pigstays, with 3 fine pigs. These latter having been washed overboard, but some half-hour before the wind began to ease, which it did very quickly, though a very ugly sea ran for some hours after. The wind left us just before dark, and when morning came it brought weather, splendid weather, a calm, mildly undulating sea and a brilliant sun with no wind. It showed us also that we were not alone, for about 2 miles away to the westward was another vessel, which Mr. Selvern, the second mate, pointed out to me. That's a pretty rum-looking packet, Doctor, he said, and handed me his glass. I looked through it at the other vessel and saw what he meant, at least I thought I did. Yes, Mr. Selvern, I said, she's got a pretty old-fashioned look about her. Well, he laughed at me in his pleasant way. It's easy to see you're not a sailor, Doctor, he remarked. There's a dozen rum things about her. She's a derelict, and has been floating around by the look of her for many a score of years. Look at the shape of her counter, and the bows and cutwater. She's as old as the hills, as you might say, and ought to have gone down to Davy Jones a good while ago. Oh, look at the growths on her, and the thickness of her standing rigging. That's all salt incrustations, I fancy. Well, if you notice the white colour. Well, she's been a small bark, but don't you see, she's not a yard left aloft. Well, they've all dropped out of the slings, everything rotted away. Wonder the standing rigging hasn't gone too. Oh, I wish the old man had let us take the boat and have a look at her. Oh, she'd be well worth it.
There seemed little chance, however, of this, for all hands were turned to and kept hard at it all day, repairing the damage to the masts and gear, and this took a long while, as you may think. Part of the time I gave a hand heaving on one of the deck capstans, for the exercise was good for my liver. Old Captain Gannington approved, and I persuaded him to come along and try some of the same medicine, which he did, and we got very chummy over the job. Well, we got talking about the derelict, and he remarked how lucky we were not to have run full tilt onto her in the darkness, for she lay right away to the leeward of us, according to the way we'd been drifting in the storm. He was also of the opinion that she had a strange look about her, that she was pretty old, but on this latter point he plainly had far less knowledge than the second mate, for he was, as I've said, an illiterate man, and knew nothing of seacraft beyond what experience had taught him. He lacked the book knowledge which the second mate had of vessels previous to his day, which it appeared the derelict was.
She's an old un, Doctor,
was the extent of his observations in this direction. Yet, when I mentioned to him that it would be interesting to go aboard and give her a bit of an overhaul, he nodded his head as if the idea had already been in his mind and accorded with his own inclinations.
When the work's over, Doctor, he said. Can't spare the men now, you know. Got to keep all ship-shape and ready as smart as we can, but we'll take my jig and go off in the second dog watch. The glass is steady, and it'll be a bit of a gam for us. Well, that evening after tea, the captain gave orders to clear the jig and get her overboard.
The second mate was to come with us, and the skipper gave him word to see that 2 or 3 lamps were put into the boat, as it would soon fall dark. A little later we were pulling across the calmness of the sea with a crew of 6 at the oars, and making very good speed of it. Now, gentlemen, I have detailed to you with great exactness all the facts, both big and little, so that you can follow step by step each incident in this extraordinary affair. I want you now to pay the closest attention. I was sitting in the stern sheets with the second mate and the captain, who was steering, and as we drew nearer and nearer to the stranger, as indeed did Captain Gannington and the second mate. She was, as you know, to the westward of us, and the sunset was making a great flame of red light to the back of her, so that she showed a little blurred and indistinct by reason of the halation of the night, which almost defeated the eye in any attempt to see our rotting spars and standing rigging, submerged as they were in the fiery glory of the sunset. It was because of this effect of the sunset that we had come quite close, comparatively, to the derelict before we saw that she was all surrounded by a sort of curious scum, the colour of which was difficult to decide upon by reason of the red light that was in the atmosphere, but which afterwards we discovered to be brown. This scum spread all about the old vessel for many hundreds of yards in a huge irregular patch, a great stretch of which reached out to the eastward, upon the starboard side of the boat some score or so fathoms away.
Queer stuff,
said Captain Gannington, leaning to the side and looking over. Something in the cargo was gone rotten, and worked out through her seams.
Look at her bows and stern, said the second mate. Just look at the growth on her.
There were, as he said, great clumpings of strange-looking sea fungi under the bows and the short counter astern. From the stump of her jibboom and the cutwater, great beards of rime and marine growths hung downward into the scum that held her in. Her blank starboard side was presented to us, all a dead, dirtyish white, streaked and mottled vaguely with dull masses of heavier colour.
There's a steam or haze rising off her,
said the second mate, speaking again.
You can see it against the light. Ooh, it keeps coming and going. Look.
Well, I saw then what he meant. A faint haze or steam, either suspended above the old vessel or rising from her. And Captain Gannington saw it also.
Spontaneous combustion, he exclaimed. We'll have to watch when he lift the hatches, unless it's some poor devil that's got aboard of her. But that ain't likely.
We were now within a couple of 100 yards of the old derelict, and had entered into the brown scum. As it poured off the lifted oars, I heard one of the men mutter to himself,
"Oh, damn treacle."
And indeed it was not something unlike it. As the boat continued to forge nearer and nearer to the old ship, the scum grew thicker and thicker, so that, at last, it perceptibly slowed us down.
"Give way, lads. Put some beef into it,"
sang out Captain Gannington. And thereafter there was no sound except the panting of men and the faint, reiterated suck, suck of the sullen brown scum upon the oars as the boat was forced ahead. As we went, I was conscious of a peculiar smell in the evening air, and whilst I had no doubt that the putting of the scum by the oars made it rise, I could give no name to it. Yet in a way it was vaguely familiar. We were now very close to the old vessel, and presently she was high about us against the dying light. The captain called out then to
"In with the boat oars and stand by the boat hook,"
which was done.
"Aboard there! Ahoy! Aboard there! Ahoy!"
shouted Captain Gannington, but there came no answer. Only the dull sound of his voice going lost into the open sea, each time he sung out.
"Ahoy aboard there! Ahoy!"
he shouted time after time, but there was only the weary silence of the old hulk that answered us, and somehow as he shouted, the while that I stared up half expectantly at her, a queer little sense of oppression that amounted almost to nervousness came upon me. It passed, but I remember how I was suddenly aware that it was growing dark. Now, darkness comes fairly rapidly in the tropics, though not so quickly as many fiction writers seem to think. But it was not that the coming dusk had perceptibly deepened in that brief time of only a few moments, but rather that my nerves had made me suddenly a little hypersensitive. Now, I mention my state particularly, for I'm not a nervy man normally, and my abrupt touch of nerves is significant in light of what happened.
"There's no one on board there,"
said Captain Gannington.
"Give way, men."
For the boat's crew had instinctively rested on their oars as the captain hailed the old craft. The men gave way again, and then the second mate called out excitedly,
"Oi, look there! There's our pigsty. See, it's got biopsy painted on the end. Oh, it's drifted down here and the scum's caught it. Oh, what a blessed wonder."
It was, as he said, our pigsty that had been washed overboard in the storm, and most extraordinary to come across it there.
"We'll tow it off with us when we go,"
said the captain, and shouted to the crew to get down to their oars, for they were hardly moving the boat, because the scum was so thick close in around the old ship that it literally clogged the boat from moving. I remember that it struck me, in a half-conscious sort of way, as curious that the pigsty, containing our 3 dead pigs, had managed to drift in so far unaided, whilst we could scarcely manage to force the boat in, now that we'd come right into the scum. But the thought passed from my mind, for so many things happened within the next few minutes. The man managed to bring the boat in alongside, within a couple of feet of the derelict, and the man with the boat hook hooked on.
"Have you got hold there, for'ard?"
asked Captain Gannington.
"Yes, sir,"
said the bowman, and as he spoke, there came a queer noise of tearing.
"What's that?"
said the captain.
"It's tore, sir. Tore clean away,"
said the man, and his tone showed that he had received something of a shock.
"Oh, get a hold again, then,"
said Captain Gannington irritably.
"Don't suppose this packet was built yesterday. Shove the hook into the main chains."
The man did so gingerly, as you might say, for it seemed to me, in the growing dusk, that he put no strain onto the hook, though of course there was no need. You could see the boat could not go very far of herself, in the stuff in which she was embedded. I remember thinking this, also, as I looked up at the bulging side of the old vessel, and then I heard Captain Gannington's voice.
"Lord, but she's old. And what a colour, Doctor. Oh, she don't want half a pint, do she? Now then, somebody, one of them oars."
An oar was passed to him, and he leant it up against the ancient, bulging side. Then he paused and called to the second mate to light a couple of the lamps and stand by to pass them up, for darkness had settled down now upon the sea. The second mate lit 2 of the lamps and told one of the men to light a third and keep it handy in the boat, and then he stepped across, with a lamp in each hand, to where Captain Gannington stood by the oar against the side of the ship.
"Now, my lad,"
said the captain to the man who had pulled the stroke,
"up with you, and I'll pass ye up the lamps."
Well, the man jumped to obey, caught the oar and put his weight upon it, and as he did so, something seemed to give way a little.
"Look,"
cried out the second mate, and pointed, lamp in hand.
"It's sunk in."
This was true. The oar had made quite an indentation into the bulging, somewhat slimy side of the old vessel.
"Mould, I reckon,"
said Captain Gannington, bending towards the derelict to look, and then to the man.
"Up you go, my lad, and be smart. Don't stand there waiting."
At that, the man, who had paused a moment as he felt the oar give beneath his weight, began to shin up, and in a few seconds he was aboard, and leant out over the rail for the lamps. These were passed up to him, and the captain called to him to steady the oar. And then Captain Gannington went, calling for me to follow, and after me the second mate. And as the captain put his face over the rail, he gave a cry of astonishment.
"Mould, by gum! Mould! Tons of it! Oh, good Lord!"
As I heard him shout that, I scrambled the more eagerly after him, and in a moment or two I was able to see what he meant. Everywhere that the light from the 2 lamps struck, there was nothing but smooth, great masses and surfaces of a dirty white-coloured mould. I climbed over the rail, with the second mate close behind, and stood upon the mould-covered decks. Well, there might have been no planking beneath the mould, for all that our feet could feel. It gave way under our tread with a spongy, puddingy feel. It covered the deck furniture of the old ship so that the shape of each article and fitment was often no more than suggested through it. Captain Gannington snatched a lamp from the man, and the second mate reached for the other. They held the lamps high, and we all stared. It was most extraordinary, and somehow most abominable. I can think of no other word, gentlemen, that so much describes the predominant feeling that affected me at the moment.
"Good Lord,"
said Captain Gannington several times.
"Good Lord."
But neither the second mate nor the man said anything, and, for my part, I just stared, and at the same time began to smell a little at the air, for there was a vague odour of something half familiar that somehow brought to me a sense of half-known fright. I turned this way and that, staring, as I've said. Here and there the mould was so heavy as to entirely disguise what lay beneath, converting the deck fittings into indistinguishable mounds of mould, all dirty white and blotched and veined with irregular, dull, purplish markings. There was a strange thing about the mould, which Captain Gannington drew attention to. It was that our feet did not crush into it and break the surface, as might have been expected, but merely indented it.
"I never seen nothing like it before. Never,"
said the captain after having stooped with his lamp to examine the mould under our feet. He stamped with his heel, and the mould gave out a dull, puddingy sound. He stooped again, and with a quick movement, stared, holding the lamp close to the deck.
"Oh, blessed if it ain't a regular skin to it."
The second mate and the man and I all stooped and looked at it. The second mate prodded it with his forefinger, and I remember I rapped it several times with my knuckles, listening to the dead sound it gave out, and noticing the close, firm texture of the mould.
"Oh,"
the second mate said.
"Oh, it's just like blessed dough.
Oof." He stood up with a quick movement.
"Oh, I could fancy it stinks a bit,"
he said. As he said this, I knew, suddenly, what the familiar thing was in the vague odour that hung about us.
It was that the smell had something animal-like in it. Something of the same smell, only heavier, that you would smell in any place that's infested with mice. I began to look about with a sudden, very real uneasiness. There might be vast numbers of hungry rats aboard. They might prove exceedingly dangerous, if in a starving condition. Yet, as you will understand, somehow I hesitated to put forward my idea as a reason for caution. It was too fanciful. Captain Gannington had begun to go aft along the mould-covered main deck with the second mate, each of them holding their lamps high up so as to cast a good light about the vessel. I turned quickly and followed them, the man with me keeping close to my heels, and plainly uneasy. As we went, I became aware that there was a feeling of moisture in the air, and I remembered the slight mist or smoke above the hulk, which had made Captain Gannington suggest spontaneous combustion in explanation. And, always as we went, there was that vague animal smell. Suddenly I found myself wishing we were well away from this old vessel. Abruptly, after a few paces, the captain stopped and pointed at a row of mould-hidden shapes on each side of the main deck. "Guns," he said. "Been a privateer in the old days, I guess. Maybe worse. We'll have a look below, Doctor. There may be something worth touching. She's older than I thought. Mr. Salvin thinks she's about 200 years old, but I scarce think it." While we continued our way aft, I remember that I found myself walking as lightly and gingerly as possible, as if I were subconsciously afraid of treading through the rotten, mould-hid decks. I think the others had a touch of the same feeling from the way they were walking. Occasionally the soft stuff would grip on our heels, releasing them with a little sullen suck. The captain forged somewhat ahead of the second mate, and I know that the suggestion he'd made himself that perhaps there might be something below worth carrying away had stimulated his imagination. The second mate was, however, beginning to feel somewhat the same way I did. At least, I have that impression. I think if it had not been for what I might truly describe as Captain Gannington's sturdy courage, we should all of us have just gone back over the side very soon, for there was most certainly an unwholesome feeling abroad that made one feel queerly lacking in pluck, and you'll soon see that this feeling was justified. Just as the captain reached the few mould-covered steps leading up onto the short half-poop, I was suddenly aware that the feeling of moisture in the air had grown very much more definite. It was perceptible now, intermittently, as a sort of thin, moist, fog-like vapour that came and went oddly, and seemed to make the decks a little indistinct to the view, this time and that. Once an odd puff of it beat up suddenly from somewhere and caught me in the face, carrying a queer, sickly heavy odour with it that somehow frightened me strangely with a suggestion of waiting and half-comprehended danger. We'd followed Captain Gannington up the 3 mould-covered steps, and now went slowly along the raised afterdeck. By the mizzenmast, Captain Gannington paused, and held his lantern near to it. "My word, mister," he said to the second mate, "it's fair thickened up with mould. Why, I'll guarantee it's close on 4 foot thick." He shone the light down to where it met the deck. "Oh, good Lord," he said. "Look at the sea lice on it." They stepped up, and it was as he'd said. The sea lice were thick upon it, some of them huge, not less than the size of large beetles, and all a clear, colourless shade, like water, except there were little spots of grey on them. "I've never seen the like of 'em, except on a live cod," said Captain Gannington in an extremely puzzled voice. "My word, but they're whoppers." Then he passed on, but a few paces farther aft he stopped again, and held his lamp near to the mould-hidden deck. "Oh, Lord bless me, Doctor," he called out in a low voice. "Did you ever see the like of that? Why, it's a foot long if it's an inch." I stooped over his shoulder and saw what he meant. It was a clear, colourless creature about a foot long and about 8 inches high, with a curved back that was extraordinarily narrow.
As we stared, all in a group, it gave a queer little flick and was gone.
"Jumped,"
said the captain.
"Well, if that ain't a giant of all the sea lice that I've ever seen. I guess it's jumped 20 foot clear."
He straightened his back and scratched his head a moment, swinging the lantern this way and that with the other hand and staring about us.
"What are they doing aboard here?"
he said.
"Oh, you'll see 'em. Little things, on fat cod and such like. I'm blowed, Doctor, if I understand."
He held his lamp towards a big mound of the mould that occupied part of the after portion of the lower poop deck, a little foreside of where there came a 2-foot-high break to a kind of second and loftier poop that ran aft to the taffrail. The mound was pretty big, several feet across, and more than a yard high. Captain Gannington walked up to it.
"I reckon this is the skull,"
he remarked, and gave it a heavy kick. The only result was a deep indentation to the huge whitish lump of mould, as if he'd driven his foot into a mass of some doughy substance. Yet I'm not altogether correct in saying that this was the only result, for a certain other thing happened. From the place made by the captain's foot there came a sudden gush of a purplish fluid, accompanied by a peculiar smell that was, and was not, half familiar. Some of the mould-like substance had stuck to the toe of the captain's boot, and from this likewise there issued a sweat, as it were, of the same colour.
"Well?"
said Captain Gannington in surprise, and drew back his foot to make another kick at the hump of mould. But he paused at an exclamation from the second mate.
"Oh, don't, sir,"
said the second mate. I glanced at him, and the light from Captain Gannington's lamp showed me that his face had a bewildered, half-frightened look, as if he were suddenly and unexpectedly half afraid of something, and as if his tongue had given way his sudden fright, without any intention on his part to speak. The captain also turned and stared at him.
"Why, mister?"
he asked in a somewhat puzzled voice, through which there sounded just the vaguest hint of annoyance.
"We've got to shift this mug if we're to get below."
I looked at the second mate, and it seemed to me that, curiously enough, he was listening less to the captain than to some other sound. Suddenly he said, in a queer voice,
"Listen, everybody."
Yet we heard nothing, beyond the faint murmur of the men talking together in the boat alongside.
I don't hear nothing,"
said Captain Gannington after a short pause.
"Do you, Doctor?" "No," I said. "What was it you thought you heard?"
the captain, turning again to the second mate. But the second mate shook his head in a curious, almost irritable way, as if the captain's question interrupted his listening. Captain Gannington stared a moment at him, then held his lantern up and glanced about him almost uneasily. Oh, I know I felt a queer sense of strain, but the light showed nothing beyond the greyish, dirty white of the mould in all directions.
"Mr. Selvern," said the captain at last, looking at him, "don't get fancying things. Get hold of your bloomin' self. You know you heard nothing." "I'm quite sure I heard something, sir," said the second mate. "I seem to hear—"
He broke off sharply and appeared to listen with an almost painful intensity.
"What did it sound like?"
I asked.
"It's all right, Doctor,"
said Captain Gannington, laughing gently.
"You can give him a tonic when we get back. I'm going to shift this stuff."
He drew back and kicked for a second time at the ugly mass which he'd taken to hide the companionway. The result of his kick was startling, for the whole thing wobbled sloppily, like a mound of unhealthy-looking jelly. He drew his foot out of it quickly, took a step backward, staring and holding his lamp towards it.
"By gum,"
he said, and it was plain that he was generally startled.
"The blessed thing's gone soft."
Well, the man had run back several steps from the suddenly flaccid mound, and looking horribly frightened, though of what, I'm sure he had not the least idea. The second mate stood where he was and stared. And for my part, I know I had a most hideous uneasiness upon me. The captain continued to hold his light towards the wobbling mound and stare.
"It's gone all squashy through," he said. "There's no skull there, There's no bally woodwork inside that lot. Ooh, what a rum smell.
He walked round to the after side of the strange mound to see whether there might be some signs of an opening into the hull at the back of the great heap of mould stuff. And then,
"Listen,"
said the second mate again, in the strangest sort of voice. Captain Gallington straightened himself upright, and there succeeded a pause of the most intense quietness, in which there was not even the hum of talk from the men alongside in the boat. We all heard it. A kind of dull, soft thud, 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 thud. Somewhere in the hull under us, yet so vague as to make me half doubtful I'd heard it, only that the others did so too. Captain Gallington turned suddenly to where the man stood.
"Tell them,"
he began. But the fellow cried out something and pointed. There had come a strange intensity into his somewhat unemotional face, so the captain's glance followed his action instantly. I stared also, as you may think. It was the great mound at which the man was pointing, and I saw what he meant. From the two gapes made in the mould-like stuff by Captain Gallington's boots, the purple fluid was jetting out in a queerly regular fashion, almost as if it were being forced out by a pump. My word, but I stared, and even as I stared a larger jet squirted out and splashed as far as the man, spattering his boots and trouser legs. The fellow had been pretty nervous before, in a stolid, ignorant sort of way, and his funk had been growing steadily. But at this he simply let out a yell and turned about to run. He paused an instant, as if a sudden fear of the darkness that held the decks between him and the boat had taken him. He snatched at the second mate's lantern, tore it out of his hand, and plunged heavily away over the vile stretch of mould. Mr. Selvin, the second mate, said not a word. He was just staring at the strange-smelling twin streams of dull purple that were jetting out from the wobbling mound. Captain Gallington, however, roared an order to the man to come back, but the man plunged on and on across the mould, his feet seeming to be clogged by the stuff, as if it had suddenly grown soft. He zigzagged as he ran, the lantern swaying in wild circles as he wrenched his feet free with a constant plop, plop, and I could hear his frightened gasps even from where I stood.
"Come back with that lamp,"
roared the captain again, but the man still took no notice. And Captain Gallington was silent an instant, his lips working in a queer, inarticulate fashion, as if he were stunned momentarily by the very violence of his anger at the man's insubordination. And in the silence I heard the sounds again. Thud, 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 thud. Quite distinctly now, beating, it seemed suddenly to me, right down under my feet, but deep. I stared down at the mould on which I was standing, with a quick, disgusting sense of the terrible all about me. Then I looked at the captain and tried to say something without appearing frightened. I saw that he had turned again to the mould, and all the anger had gone out of his face. He held out his lamp towards the mound and was listening. There was another moment of absolute silence. At least I knew that I was not conscious of any sound at all in the world, except for that extraordinary thud, 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 down somewhere in the huge bulk under us. The captain shifted his feet with a sudden, nervous movement, and as he lifted them, the mould went plop, plop. He looked quickly at me, trying to smile as if he were not thinking anything very much about it.
"What do you make of it, Doctor?"
he said.
I think,"
I began, but the second mate interrupted with a single word, his voice pitched a little high, in a tone that made us both stare instantly at him.
"Look,"
he said, and pointed at the mound. The thing was all of a slow quiver. A strange ripple ran outward from it, along the deck, like you'd see a ripple run inshore out of a calm sea. It reached a mound a little foreside of us, which I'd supposed to be the cabin skylight. and in a moment the second mound sank nearly level with the surrounding decks, quivering floppily in a most extraordinary fashion. A sudden quick tremor took the mould right under the second mate, and he gave out a hoarse little cry and held his arms out on each side of him to keep his balance. The tremor in the mould spread, and Captain Gannington swayed and spread out his feet with a sudden curse of fright. The second mate jumped across to him and caught him by the wrist.
"The boat, sir,"
he said, saying the very thing that I lacked the pluck to say.
"For God's sake."
But he never finished, for a tremendous hoarse scream cut off his words. They hove themselves round and looked. I could see without turning. The man who'd run from us was standing in the waist of the ship, about a fathom from the starboard bulwarks. He was swaying from side to side and screaming in a dreadful fashion. He appeared to be trying to lift his feet, and the light from his swaying lantern showed an almost incredible sight. All about him the mould was in active movement. His feet had sunk out of sight. The stuff appeared to be lapping at his legs, and abruptly his bare flesh showed. The hideous stuff had rent his trouser leg away as if it were paper. He gave out a simply sickening scream, and, with a vast effort, wrenched one leg free. It was partly destroyed. The next instant, he pitched face downward, and the stuff heaped itself upon him as if it were actually alive, with a dreadful, severe life. It was simply infernal. The man had gone from sight. Where he had fallen was now a writhing, elongated mound in constant and horrible increase, as the mould appeared to move towards it in strange ripples from all sides. Captain Gannington and the second mate were stone silent, in amazed and incredulous horror, but I had begun to reach towards a grotesque and terrific conclusion, both helped and hindered by my professional training. From the men in the boat alongside, there was loud shouting, and I saw two of their faces appear suddenly above the rail. They showed clearly a moment in the light from the lamp which the man had snatched from Mr. Salvin, for, strangely enough, this lamp was standing upright and unharmed on the deck, a little way foreside of that dreadful, elongated, growing mound that still swayed and writhed with an incredible horror. The lamp rose and fell on the passing ripples of the mould, just, for all the world, as you will see a boat rise and fall on little swells. It's of some interest to me now, psychologically, to remember how that rising and falling lantern brought home to me more than anything the incomprehensible, dreadful strangeness of it all. The men's faces disappeared with sudden yells, as if they'd slipped or been suddenly hurt, and there was a fresh uproar of shouting from the boat. The men were calling to us to come away, to come away. In the same instant, I felt my left boot drawn suddenly and forcibly downward, with a horrible, painful grip. I wrenched it free with a yell of angry fear. Forward of us, I saw the vile surface was all amove, and abruptly I found myself shouting in a queer, frightened voice, "The boat, Captain! The boat, Captain!" Captain Gannington stared round at me, over his right shoulder, in a peculiar dull way that told me he was utterly dazed with bewilderment and the incomprehensibleness of it all. I took a quick, clogged, nervous step towards him and gripped his arm and shook it fiercely. "The boat!" I shouted at him. "The boat! For God's sake, tell the men to bring the boat aft!" Then the mound must have drawn his feet down, for abruptly he bellowed fiercely with terror, his momentary apathy giving place to furious energy. His thick-set, vastly muscular body doubled and writhed with his enormous effort, and he struck out madly, dropping the lantern. He tore his feet free, something ripping as he did so. The reality and necessity of the situation had come upon him brutishly real, and he was roaring to the men in the boat, "Bring the boat aft! Bring her aft! Bring her aft!" The second mate and I were shouting the same thing madly.
"For God's sake, be smart, lads,"
roared the captain, and stooped quickly for his lamp, which still burned. His feet were gripped again, and he hove them out, blaspheming breathlessly and leaping a yard high with his effort. Then he made a run for the side, wrenching his feet free at each step. In the same instant, the second mate cried out something and grabbed at the captain.
"He's got a hold of my feet! He's got a hold of my feet!"
he screamed. His feet had disappeared up to his boot tops, and Captain Gannington caught him round the waist with his powerful left arm, gave a mighty heave, and the next instant had him free. But both his boot soles had gone. For my part, I jumped madly from foot to foot to avoid the plucking of the mould, and suddenly I made a run for the ship's side. But before I could get there, a queer gape came in the mould between us and the side, at least a couple of feet wide, and how deep I don't know. It closed up in an instant, and all the mould where the cape had been vent into a sort of flurry of horrible ripplings, so that I ran back from it, for I did not dare to put my foot upon it. Then the captain was shouting at me,
Aft, Doctor, this way, Doctor, run!"
I saw then that he'd passed me and was up on the after-raised portion of the poop. He'd had the second mate thrown like a sack, all loose and quiet over his left shoulder, for Mr. Selvin had fainted, and his long legs flopped limp and helpless against the captain's massive knees as he ran. I saw with a queer, unconscious noting of minor details how the torn soles of the second mate's boots flapped and jigged as the captain staggered aft.
"Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy!"
shouted the captain, and then I was beside him, shouting also. The men were answering with loud yells of encouragement, and it was plain they were working desperately to force the boat aft through the thick scum about the ship. We reached the ancient, mould-hid taffrail, and slewed about breathlessly in the half-darkness to see what was happening. Captain Gannington had left his lantern by the big mound when he picked up the second mate, and as we stood, gasping, we discovered suddenly that all the mould between us and the light was full of movement. Yet the part on which we stood, for about 6 or 8 feet forward of us, was still firm. Every couple of seconds we shouted to the men to hasten, and they kept on calling to us that they would be with us in an instant. And all the time we watched the deck of that dreadful hulk, feeling, for my part, literally sick with mad suspense, and ready to jump overboard into that filthy scum all about us. Down somewhere in the huge bulk of the ship, there was all the time that extraordinary dull, ponderous thud, 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 growing ever louder. I seemed to feel the whole hull of the derelict beginning to quiver and thrill with each dull beat. And to me, with the grotesque and hideous suspicion of what made that noise, it was at once the most dreadful and incredible sound I had ever heard. As we waited desperately for the boat, I scanned incessantly so much of the grey-white bulk as the lamp showed. The whole of the deck seemed to be in strange movement. Forward of the lamp, I could see indistinctly the moundings of the mould swaying and nodding hideously beyond the circle of the brightest rays. Nearer, and in full glow of the lamp, the mound which should have indicated the skylight was swelling steadily. There were ugly purple veinings on it, and as it swelled, it seemed to me that the veinings and mottlings on it were becoming plainer, rising as though embossed upon it, like you'll see the veins stand out on the body of a powerful, full-blooded horse. It was most extraordinary. The mound that we'd supposed to cover the companionway had sunk flat with the surrounding mould, and I could not see that it jetted out any more of the purplish fluid. A quaking movement of the mound began away forward of the lamp, and came flurrying away aft towards us, and at the sight of that I climbed up on the spongy-feeling taffrail, and yelled afresh for the boat. The men answered with a shout, which told me they were nearer, but the beastly scum was so thick that it was evidently a fight to move the boat at all. Beside me, Captain Gannington was shaking the second mate furiously, and the man stirred and began to moan.
The captain shook him again. Wake up, mister, he shouted. The second mate staggered out of the captain's arms and collapsed suddenly, shrieking, My feet! Oh God, my feet! The captain and I lugged him off the mound and got him into a sitting position upon the taffrail, where he kept up a continual moaning. Hold him, doctor, said the captain, and whilst I did so, he ran forward a few yards and peered down over the starboard quarter rail. Oh, for God's sake, be smart, lads, be smart, he shouted down to the men, and they answered him, breathless, from close at hand, yet still too far away for the boat to be any use to us on the instant. I was holding the moaning, half-unconscious officer and staring forward along the poop decks. The flurrying of the mould was coming aft, slowly and noiselessly, and then, suddenly, I saw something closer. Look out, Captain, I shouted, and, even as I shouted, the mould near to him gave a sudden, peculiar slobber. I'd seen a ripple stealing towards him through the mould. He gave an enormous, clumsy leap and landed near to us on the sound part of the mould, but the movement followed him. He turned and faced it, swearing fiercely. All about his feet there came abruptly little gapings, which made horrid sucking noises. Come back, Captain, I yelled. Come back, quick! As I shouted, a ripple came at his feet, lipping at them, and he stamped insanely at it and leaped back, his boot torn half off his foot. He swore madly with pain and anger and jumped swiftly for the taffrail. Come on, Doctor, over we go, he called. Then he remembered the filthy scum and hesitated and roared out desperately to the men to hurry. I stared down also. The second mate, I said. I'll take charge, Doctor, said Captain Gannington, and caught hold of Mr. Selva. As he spoke, I thought I saw something between us, outlined against the scum. I leaned out over the stern and peered. There was something under the port quarter. There's something down there, Captain, I called, and pointed in the darkness. He stooped far over and stared. A boat, by gum, a boat, he yelled, and began to wriggle swiftly along the taffrail, dragging the second mate after him. I followed. A boat it is, sure, he exclaimed a few moments later, and picking up the second mate clear of the rail, he hove him down into the boat, where he fell with a crash into the bottom. Over you go, Doctor, he yelled at me, and pulled me bodily off the rail and dropped me after the officer. As he did so, I felt the whole of the ancient, spongy rail give a peculiar, sickening quiver and begin to wobble. I fell onto the second mate, and the captain came after, almost in the same instant, but, unfortunately, he landed clear of us onto the fore thwart, which broke under his weight with a loud crack and splintering of wood. Thank God, I heard him mutter. Thank God. I guess that was a mighty near thing to go into Hades. He struck a match just as I got to my feet, and between us we got the second mate straightened out on one of the after fore and aft thwarts. We shouted to the men in the boat, telling them where we were, and saw the light of their lantern shining round the starboard counter of the derelict. They called back to us to tell us they were doing their best, and then, whilst we waited, Captain Gannington struck another match, began to overhaul the boat we dropped into. She was a modern two-boat boat, and on the stern there was printed Cyclone Glasgow. She was in pretty fair condition, and had evidently drifted into the scum and been held by it. Captain Gannington struck several matches, and went forward towards the derelict. Suddenly, he called to me. I jumped over the thwarts to him. Look, Doctor, he said, and I saw what he meant. A mass of bones up in the bows of the boat. I stooped over them and looked. There were the bones of at least 3 people, all mixed together in an extraordinary fashion, and quite clean and dry. I had a sudden thought concerning the bones, but I said nothing, for my thought was vague in some ways and concerned the grotesque and incredible suggestion that had come to me as to the cause of that ponderous, dull thud, 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 thud,
that beat on so infernally within the hull. It was plain to hear even now that we'd got off the vessel herself. And all the while, I had a sick, horrible mental picture of that frightful, wriggling mound aboard the hulk. As Captain Gannington struck a final match, I saw something that sickened me, and the captain saw it in the same instant. The match went out, and he fumbled clumsily for another, and struck it. We saw the thing again. We had not been mistaken. A great lip of grey-white was protruding in over the edge of the boat. A great lappet of the mould was coming stealthily towards us, a live mass of the very hull itself. And suddenly Captain Gannington yelled out in so many words the grotesque and incredible thing I was thinking.
"She's alive."
I had never heard such a sound of comprehension and terror in a man's voice. The very horrified assurance of it made actual to me the thing that before had only lurked in my subconscious mind. I knew he was right. I knew that the explanation my reason and my training both repelled and reached towards was the true one. Oh, I wonder whether anyone can possibly understand our feelings in that moment. The unmitigated horror of it, and the incredibleness. As the light of the match burned up fully, I saw that the mass of living matter coming towards us was streaked and veined with purple, the veins standing out, enormously distended. The whole thing quivered continuously to each ponderous thud, 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 thud of that gargantuan organ that pulsed within the huge, great white bulk. The flame of the match reached the captain's fingers, and there came to me a little sickly whiff of burned flesh, but he seemed unconscious of any pain. Then the flame went out in a brief sizzle, yet at the last moment I'd seen an extraordinary raw look become visible upon the end of that monstrous protruding lappet. It had become dewed with a hideous purplish sweat, and with the darkness there came a sudden charnel-like stench. I heard the matchbox split in Captain Gannington's hands as he wrenched it open. Then he swore in a queer, frightened voice, for he had come to the end of his matches. He turned clumsily in the darkness and tumbled over the nearest thwart in his eagerness to get to the stern of the boat, and I after him. For we knew that thing was coming towards us through the darkness, reaching over that piteous mingled heap of human bones all jumbled together in the bows. We shouted madly to the men, and for answer saw the bows of the boat merge dimly into view round the starboard counter of the derelict. "Oh, thank God!" I gasped out, but Captain Gannington roared to them to show a light. Yet this they could not do, for the lamp had just been stepped on in their desperate efforts to force the boat round to us. "Quick, quick!" I shouted. "For God's sake, be smart, men!" roared the captain. And both of us faced the darkness under the port counter, out of which we knew, but could not see, the thing was coming for us. "An oar! Smart! Now, pass me an oar!" shouted the captain, and reached out his hands through the gloom towards the oncoming boat. I saw a figure stand up in the bows and hold something out to us across the intervening yards of scum. Captain Gannington swept his hands through the darkness and encountered it. "I've got it. Let go there," he said in a quick, tense voice. In the same instant the boat we were in was pressed over suddenly to starboard by some tremendous weight. Then I heard the captain shout, "Duck your head, Doctor." And directly afterwards he swung the heavy 14-foot oar round his head and struck into the darkness. There came a sudden squelch, and he struck again with a savage grunt of fierce energy. At the second blow the boat righted with a slow movement, and directly afterwards the other boat bumped gently into ours. Captain Gannington dropped the oar, and, springing across to the second mate, hove him up off the thwart and pitched him with knee and arms clear in over the bows among the men. They shouted to me to follow, which I did, and he came after me, bringing the oar with him. We carried the second mate aft, and the captain shouted to the men to back the boat a little. Then he got her bows clear of the boat we'd just left, and so headed out through the scum for the open sea.
"Where's Tom Harrison?"
gasped one of the men in the midst of his exertions. He happened to be Tom Harrison's particular chum, and Captain Gannington answered him briefly enough.
"Dead. Pull. Don't talk."
Now, difficult as it had been to force the boat through the scum to our rescue, the difficulty to clear seemed tenfold. After some 5 minutes pulling, the boat seemed hardly to have moved a fathom, if so much, and quite dreadful fear took me afresh, which one of the panting men put suddenly into words.
"He's got us,"
he gasped out.
"Same as poor Tom."
It was the man who'd inquired where Harrison was.
"Shut your mouth and pull,"
roared the captain. And so another few minutes passed. Abruptly, it seemed to me that the dull, ponderous thud, 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 thud came more plainly through the dark, and I stared intently over the stern. I sickened a little, for I could almost swear that the dark mass of the monster was actually nearer, that it was coming nearer to us through the darkness. Captain Gannington must have had the same thought, for after a brief look into the darkness, he jumped forward and began to double bank the stroke-oar.
"Get forward under the oars, Doctor,"
he said to me rather breathlessly.
"Get in the bows and see if you can't free the stuff a bit around the bows."
I did as he told me, and a minute later I was in the bows of the boat, puddling the scum from side to side and trying to break up the viscid, clinging muck. A heavy, almost animal-like smell arose off of it, and all the air seemed full of the deadening, heavy smell. I shall never find words to tell anyone on earth the whole horror of it all. The threat that seemed to hang in the very air around us, and but a little astern, that incredible thing, coming, as I firmly believed, nearer, and scum holding us like half-melted glue. The minutes passed in a deadly, eternal fashion, and I kept staring back astern into the darkness, but never ceasing to puddle that filthy scum, striking at it and switching it from side to side until I sweated. Abruptly, Captain Gannington sang out,
"We're gaining, lads. Pull."
And I felt the boat forge ahead perceptibly, as they gave way with renewed hope and energy. There was soon no doubt of it, for presently that hideous thud, 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 thud had grown quite dim and vague somewhere astern, and I could no longer see the derelict, for the night had come down tremendously dark, and all the sky was thick, overset with heavy clouds. As we drew nearer and nearer to the edge of the scum, the boat moved more and more perceptibly, until suddenly we emerged with a clean, sweet, fresh sound into the open sea.
"Thank God,"
I said aloud, and drew in the boat hook, and made my way aft again to where Captain Gannington now sat once more at the tiller. I saw him looking anxiously up at the sky and across to where the lights of our vessel burned, and again he would seem to listen intently, so that I found myself listening also.
"What's that, Captain?"
I said sharply, for it seemed to me that I heard a sound far astern, something between a queer whine and a low whistling.
"What is that?"
"It's wind, Doctor," he said in a low voice. "I wish to God we were aboard." Then, to the men,
"Pull. Put your backs into it, or you'll never put your teeth through good bread again."
The men obeyed nobly, and we reached the vessel safely, and had the boat safely stowed before the storm came, which it did in a furious white smother out of the west. I could see it for some minutes beforehand, tearing the sea in the gloom into a wall of phosphorescent foam, and as it came nearer, that peculiar whining, piping sound grew louder and louder, until it was like a vast steam whistle rushing towards her. And when it did come, we got it very heavy indeed, so that the morning showed us nothing but a welter of white seas, with that grim derelict many a score of miles away in the smother, lost as utterly as our hearts could wish to lose her. When I came to examine the second mate's feet, I found them in a very extraordinary condition. The soles of them had the appearance of having been partly digested. I know of no other word that so exactly describes their condition, and the agony the man suffered must have been dreadful.
Now, concluded the doctor, that is what I call a case in point. If we could know exactly what the old vessel had originally been loaded with, and the juxtaposition of the various articles of her cargo, plus the heat and the time she'd endured, plus one or two other only guessable quantities, we should have solved the chemistry of the life force, gentlemen. Not necessarily the origin, mind you, but at least we should have taken a big step on the way. I've often regretted that gale, you know. In a way, that is, in a way. It was a most amazing discovery, but at the same time I had nothing but thankfulness to be rid of it. A most amazing chance. I often think of the way the monster woke out of its torpor. Oh, and that scum. The dead pigs caught in it. Oh, I fancy that was a grim kind of a net, gentlemen. And it caught many things. The old doctor sighed and nodded. If I could have had a bill of lading, he said, his eyes full of regret. It might have told me something to help. But, anyway. He began to fill his pipe again. I suppose, he ended, looking round at us gravely, I suppose we humans are an ungrateful lot of beggars at the best, but, oh, what a chance. What a chance, eh?
The following pages are from a notebook that was discovered lying at the foot of an oak tree beside the Lincoln Highway, between Bowman and Auburn. They would have been dismissed immediately as the work of a disordered mind if it had not been for the unaccountable disappearance, 8 days before, of James Buckingham and Edgar Halpin. Experts testified that the handwriting was undoubtedly that of Buckingham. The silver dollar and a handkerchief marked with Buckingham's initials were also found not far from the notebook. Not everyone perhaps will believe that my 10 years' hatred for Edgar Halpin was the impelling force that drove me to the perfecting of a most unique invention. Only those who have detested and loathed another man with the black further of the feeling I had conceived will understand the patience with which I sought to devise a revenge that should be safe and adequate at the same time. The wrong he had done me was one that must be expiated sooner or later, and nothing short of his death would be sufficient. However, I did not care to hang, not even for a crime that I could regard as nothing more than the mere execution of justice, and, as a lawyer, I knew how difficult, how practically impossible, was the commission of a murder that would leave no betraying evidence. Therefore I puzzled long and fruitlessly as to the manner in which Halpin should die, before my inspiration came to me. I had reason enough to hate Edgar Halpin. We had been bosom friends all through our school days and through the first years of our professional life as law partners. But when Halpin married the one woman I had ever loved with complete devotion, all friendship ceased on my side and was replaced by an ice-like barrier of inexorable enmity. Even the death of Alice 5 years after the marriage made no difference, for I could not forgive the happiness of which I had been deprived, the happiness that they'd shared during those years, like the thieves they were. I felt that she would have cared for me if it had not been for Halpin. Indeed, she and I had been almost engaged before the beginning of his rivalry. It must not be supposed, however, that I was indiscreet enough to betray my feelings at any time. Halpin was my daily associate in the Auburn law firm to which we belonged, and I continued to be a most welcome and frequent guest at his home. I doubt if he ever knew that I cared greatly for Alice. I am secretive and undemonstrative by temperament, and also I am proud. No one, except Alice herself, ever surmised my suffering, and even she knew nothing of my resentment. Harpin himself trusted me, and, nurturing as I did the idea of retaliation at some future time, I took care that he should continue to trust me. I made myself necessary to him in all ways. I helped him when my heart was a cauldron of seething poisons. I spoke words of brotherly affection and clapped him on the back when I would rather have driven a dagger through him. I knew all the tortures and all the nausea of a hypocrite, and day after day, year after year, I made varying plans for an ultimate revenge. Apart from my legal studies and duties, during those 10 years, I apprised myself of everything available that dealt with the methods of murder. Crimes of passion allured me with a fateful interest, and I read untiringly the records of particular cases. I made a study of weapons and poisons, and as I studied them, I pictured to myself the death of Harpin in every conceivable way. I imagined the deed as being done at all hours of the day and night, in a multitude of places. The only flaw in these dreams was my inability to think of any spot that would assure perfect safety from subsequent detection. It was my bent towards scientific speculation and experiment that finally gave me the clue I sought. I had long been familiar with the theory that other worlds or dimensions may coexist in the same space with ours, by reason of a different molecular structure and vibrational rate, rendering them intangible to us. One day, when I was indulging in a murderous fantasy, in which for the 1000th time I imagined myself throttling Harpin with my bare hands, it occurred to me that some unseen dimension, if one could only penetrate it, would be the ideal place for the commission of a homicide. All circumstantial evidence, as well as the corpse itself, would be lacking, in other words. One would have a perfect absence of what is known as the corpus delicti. The problem of how to obtain entrance to this dimension was, of course, an unsolved one, but I did not feel that it would necessarily prove insoluble. I set myself immediately to a consideration of the difficulties to be overcome, and the possible ways and means. There are reasons why I do not care to set forth in this narrative the details of the various experiments to which I was drawn during the next 3 years. The theory that underlay my tests and researches was a very simple one, but the processes involved were highly intricate. In brief, the premise from which I worked was that the vibratory rate of objects in the fourth dimension could be artificially established by means of some mechanism, and that things or persons exposed to the influence of the vibration could be transported thereby to this alien realm. For a long time all my experiments were condemned to failure, because I was groping among mysterious powers and recondite laws whose motive principle I had not wholly grasped. I will not even hint at the basic nature of the device which brought my ultimate success, for I do not want others to follow where I have gone and find themselves in the same dismal predicament. I will say, however, that the desired vibration was attained by condensing ultraviolet rays in a refractive apparatus made of certain very sensitive materials which I will not name. The resultant power was stored in a kind of battery, and could be emitted from a vibratory disc suspended above an ordinary office chair, exposing everything beneath the disc to the influence of the new vibration. The range of the influence could be closely regulated by means of an insulating attachment. By the use of the apparatus, I finally succeeded in precipitating various articles into the fourth dimension. A dinner plate, a bust of Dante, a Bible, a French novel, and a house cat. All disappeared from sight and touch in a few instants when the ultraviolet power was turned upon them. I knew that henceforth they were functioning as atomic entities in a world where all things had the same vibratory rate that had been artificially induced by means of my mechanism. Before venturing into the invisible domain myself, it was of course necessary to have some way of returning. I invented a second battery and a second vibratory disc, through which, by the use of certain infrared rays, the vibrations of our own world could be established. By turning the force from the disc on the very same spot where the dinner plate and other articles had disappeared, I succeeded in recovering all of them. All were absolutely unchanged, and though several months had gone by, the cat had not suffered in any way from its fourth-dimensional incarceration. The infrared device was portable, and I meant to take it with me on my visit to the new realm in the company of Edgar Halpin. I, but not Halpin, would return anon to resume the threads of mundane existence. My experiments had all been carried on with utter secrecy. To mask their real nature, as well as to provide myself with the needful privacy, I built a small laboratory in the woods of an uncultivated ranch that I owned, lying midway between Auburn and Bowman. Here I retired at varying intervals when I had the requisite leisure, ostensibly to conduct some chemical experiments of an educative but far from unusual type. I never admitted anyone to the laboratory, and no great amount of curiosity was evinced by friends and acquaintances regarding its contents or the tests I was carrying on. Never did I breathe a syllable to anyone that could indicate the true goal of my researches. I shall never forget the jubilation I felt when the infrared device had proven its practicality by retrieving the plate, the bust, the 2 volumes, and the cat. I was so eager for the consummation of my long-delayed revenge that I did not even consider a preliminary personal trip into the fourth dimension. I had determined that Edgar Halpin must precede me when I went. I did not feel, however, that it would be wise to tell him anything concerning the real nature of my device, or the proposed excursion. Halpin at this time was suffering from recurrent attacks of terrific neuralgia. One day, when he complained more than usual, I told him, under the seal of confidence, that I'd been working on a vibratory invention for the relief of such maladies, and had finally perfected it. "I'll take you out to the laboratory tonight. You can try it," I said. "It'll fix you up in a jiffy. All you'll have to do will be to sit on a chair and let me turn on the current. But don't say anything to anybody." "Thanks, old man," he rejoined. "I'll certainly be grateful if you can do anything to stop this damnable pain. It feels like electric drills boring through my head all the time." I had chosen my time well, for all things were favorable to the maintenance of the secrecy I desired. Halpin lived on the outskirts of the town, and he was alone for the nonce, his housekeeper having gone away on a brief visit to some sick relative. The night was murky and foggy, and I drove to Halpin's house and stopped for him shortly after the dinner hour, when few people were abroad. I do not think anyone saw us when we left the town. I followed a rough and little used by-road for most of the way to my laboratory, saying that I did not care to meet other cars in the thick fog, if I could avoid it. We passed no one, and I felt this was a good omen, and that everything had combined to further my plan. Halpin uttered an exclamation of surprise when I turned on the lights in my laboratory. "I didn't dream you had so much stuff here," he remarked, peering about with respectful curiosity as the long array of unsuccessful appliances which I had thrown aside in the course of my labors. I pointed to the chair above which the ultraviolet vibrator was suspended. "Take a seat, Ed," I enjoined him. "We'll soon cure everything that ails you." "Sure you ain't gonna electrocute me?" he joked, as he obeyed my direction. A thrill of fierce triumph ran through me like the stimulation of some rare elixir when he had seated himself. Everything was in my power now, and the moment of recompense for my 10 years' humiliation and suffering was at hand. Halpin was so unsuspecting. The thought of any danger to himself, of any treachery on my part, would have been fantastically incredible to him. Putting my hand beneath my coat, I caressed the hilt of the hunting knife that I carried. "All set?" I asked him. "Sure, Mike. Go ahead and shoot." I'd found the exact range that would involve all of Halpin's body without affecting the chair itself. Fixing my gaze upon him, I pressed the little knob that turned on the current of vibratory rays. The result was practically instantaneous. for he seemed to melt like a puff of thinning smoke. I could still see his outlines for a moment, and the look of a phantasmal astonishment on his face. And then he was gone. Utterly gone. Perhaps it will be a source of wonderment that, having annihilated Halpin as far as all earthly existence was concerned, I was not content merely to leave him in the unseen, intangible plane to which he had been transposed. Would that I had been content to do so. But the wrong I'd suffered was hot and cankerous within me, and I could not bear to think that he still lived in any form or upon any plane. Nothing but absolute death would suffice to assuage my resentment, and the death must be inflicted by my own hand. It now remained to follow Halpin into that realm which no man had ever visited before, and of whose geographical conditions and characteristics I had formed no idea whatsoever. I felt sure, however, that I could enter it and return safely, after disposing of my victim. The return of the cat left no apparent room for doubt on that score. I turned out the lights, and seating myself in the chair with a portable infrared vibrator in my arms, I switched on the ultraviolet power. The sensation I felt was that of one who falls with nightmare velocity into a great gulf. My ears were deaf with the intolerable thunder of my descent. A frightful sickness overcame me, and I was near to losing all consciousness for a moment, in the black vortex of roaring space and force that seemed to draw me nadirward through the ultimate pits. Then the speed of my fall was gradually retarded, and I came gently down to something that was solid beneath my feet. There was a dim glimmering of light that grew stronger as my eyes accustomed themselves to it, and by this light I saw Halpin standing a few feet away. Behind him were dark, amorphous rocks and the vague outlines of a desolate landscape of low mounds and primordial, treeless flats. Even though I'd hardly known what to expect, I was somewhat surprised by the character of the environment in which I found myself. At a guess, I would have said that the fourth dimension would be something more colorous and complex, and varied a land of multified hues and many-angled forms. However, in its drear and primitive desolation, the place was truly ideal for the commission of the act I had intended. Halpin came toward me in the doubtful light. There was a dazed and almost idiotic look on his face, and he stuttered a little as he tried to speak. "Oh, what happened?" he articulated at last. "Never mind what happened. It isn't a circumstance to what's going to happen now." I laid the portable vibrator aside on the ground as I spoke. The dazed look was still on Halpin's face when I drew the hunting knife and stabbed him through the body with one clean thrust. In that thrust, all the stifled hatred, all the cankering resentment of 10 insufferable years was finally vindicated. He fell in a twisted heap, twitched a little, and lay still. The blood oozed very slowly from his side and formed a puddle. I remember wondering at its slowness even then, for the oozing seemed to go on through hours and days. Somehow, as I stood there, I was obsessed by a feeling of utter unreality. No doubt the long strain I'd been under, the daily stress of indurate emotions and decade-deferred hopes, had left me unable to realize the final consummation of my desire when it came. The whole thing seemed no more than one of the homicidal daydreams in which I'd imagined myself stabbing Halpin to the heart and seeing his hateful body lie before me. At length I decided that it was time to effect my return, for surely nothing could be gained by lingering any longer inside Halpin's corpse amid the unutterable dreariness of the fourth-dimensional landscape. I erected the vibrator in a position where its rays could be turned upon myself, and pressed the switch. I was aware of a sudden vertigo, and felt that I was about to begin another descent into fathomless vortical gulfs. But, though the vertigo persisted, nothing happened, and I found that I was still standing beside the corpse, in the same dismal milieu. Confoundment and growing consternation crept over me. Apparently, for some unknown reason, the vibrator would not work in the way I'd so confidently expected. Perhaps in these new surroundings there was some barrier to the full development of the infrared power. I do not know, but at any rate, there I was, in a truly singular and far from agreeable predicament. I do not know how long I fooled in a mounting frenzy with the mechanism of the vibrator, in the hope that something had temporarily gone wrong and could be remedied, if the difficulty were only found. However, all my tinkerings were of no avail. The machine was in perfect working order, but the required force was wanting. I tried the experiment of exposing small articles to the influence of the rays. A silver coin in a handkerchief dissolved and disappeared very slowly. I felt they must have regained the levels of mundane existence, but evidently the vibrational force was not strong enough to transport a human being. Finally, I gave it up and threw the vibrator to the ground. In the surge of a violent despair that came upon me, I felt the need of muscular action, of prolonged movement, and I started off at once to explore the weird realm in which I had involuntarily imprisoned myself. It was an unearthly land, a land such as might have existed before the creation of life. There were undulating blanks of desolation beneath the uniform grey of a heaven without moon or sun or stars or clouds, from which an uncertain and diffuse glimmering was cast upon the world beneath. There were no shadows, for the light seemed to emanate from all directions. The soil was a grey dust in places and a grey fixity of slime in others, and the mounds I've already mentioned were like the backs of prehistoric monsters heaving from the primal ooze. There were no signs of insect or animal life. There were no trees, no herbs, not even a blade of grass, a patch of moss or lichen, or a trace of algae. Many rocks were strewn chaotically through the desolation, and their forms were such as an idiotic demon might have devised in aping the handiwork of God. The light was so dim that all things were lost at a little distance, and I could not tell whether the horizon was near or far. It seems to me that I must have wandered on for several hours, maintaining as direct a course of progression as I could. I had a compass, a thing that I always carry with me, but it refused to function. I was driven to conclude that there were no magnetic poles in this new world. Suddenly, as I rounded a pile of the vast amorphous boulders, I came to a human body that lay huddled on the ground, and say, incredulously, that it was Halpin. The blood still oozed from the fabric of his coat, and the pool it had formed was no larger than when I'd begun my journey. I felt sure that I had not wandered in a circle, as people are said to do amid unfamiliar surroundings. How, then, could I have returned to the scene of my crime? The problem nearly drove me mad as I pondered it, and I set off with frantic vigour in an opposite direction from the one I'd first taken. For all intents and purposes, the scene which I now passed was identical with the one that lay on the other side of Halpin's course. It was hard to believe that the low mounds, the drear levels of dust and ooze, and the monstrous boulders were not the same as those among which I had made my former way. As I went, I took out my watch with the idea of timing my progress, but the hands had stopped at the very moment when I had taken my plunge into the unknown space from the laboratory, and though I wound it carefully, it refused to run. After walking an enormous distance, during which, to my surprise, I felt no fatigue whatever, I came once more to the body I had sought to leave. I think that I went really mad then, for a little while. Now, after a duration of time, or eternity which I have no means of computing, I am writing this penciled account on the leaves of my notebook. I am writing it beside the corpse of Edgar Halpin, from which I have been unable to flee. For a score of excursions into the dim realms on all sides have ended by bringing me back to it after a certain interval. The corpse is still fresh, and the blood has not dried. Apparently, the thing we know as time is well-nigh non-existent in this world, or at any rate is seriously disordered in its action, and most of the normal concomitants of time are likewise absent. and space itself has the property of returning always to the same point. The voluntary movements I perform might be considered as a sort of time sequence, but in regard to involuntary things, there is little or no time movement. I experience neither physical weariness or hunger, but the horror of my situation is not to be conveyed in human language, and hell itself can hardly have devised a name for it. When I have finished writing this narration, I shall precipitate the notebook into the levels of mundane life by means of the infrared vibrator. Some obscure need of confessing my crime and telling my predicament to others has led me to an act which I should never have believed myself capable, for I am the most uncommunicative of men by nature. Apart from satisfying this need, the composition of my narrative is something to do. It's a temporary reprieve from the desperate madness that will surge upon me soon, and the grey, eternal horror of the limbo to which I have doomed myself beside the undecaying body of my victim.
Old Garfield's Heart. I was sitting on the porch when my grandfather hobbled out and sank down on his favourite chair with the cushioned seat, and began to stuff tobacco in his old corncob pipe. "I thought you'd been going to the dance," he said. "I'm waiting for Doc Blaine," I answered. "I'm going over to old man Garfield's with him." My grandfather sucked at his pipe a while before he spoke again. "Old Jim Purdy bad all?" "Doc says he has a chance." "Who's taking care of him?" "Joe Braxton, against Garfield's wishes, but somebody had to stay with him." My grandfather sucked his pipe noisily and watched the heat lightning playing away off up in the hills. And he said, "You think old Jim's the biggest liar in this county, don't you?" "He tells some pretty tall tales," I admitted. "Some of the things he claimed he took part in must have happened before he was born." "I came from Tennessee to Texas in 1870, my grandfather said abruptly. "I saw this town of Lost Knob, grew up with nothing. There wasn't even a Long Hut store here when I came, but old Jim Garfield was here, living in the same place he lives now. Only then it was a log cabin. He don't look a day older now than he did the first time I saw him." "You've never mentioned that before," I said in some surprise. "I knew you put it down to an old man's maunderings," he answered. "Old Jim was the first white man to settle in this country. He built his cabin a good 50 miles west of the frontier. God knows how he done it, for these hills swarmed with Comanches back then. I remember the first time I ever saw him. Even then, everyone called him Old Jim. Remember him telling me the same tales he told you, how he was at the Battle of San Jacinto when he was a youngster, and how he'd rode with you and Cameron and Jack Hayes. Only I believe him and you don't." "That was so long ago," I protested. "The last Indian raid through this country was in 1874, said my grandfather, engrossed in his own reminiscences. "I was in on that fight. So was old Jim. I saw him knock old Yellowtail off his Mustang at 700 yards with a buffalo rifle. But before that I was with him in a fight up near the head of Locust Creek. A band of Comanches came down Mesquite, looting and burning, rode through the hills and started back up Locust Creek, and a scout of us were hot on their heels. We ran onto them just at sundown in Mesquite Flat. Killed 7 of them, and the rest skinned out through the brush on foot. The 3 of our boys were killed, and Jim Garfield got a thrust in the breast with a lance. Oh, it was an awful wound. He lay like a dead man, and it seemed sure nobody could live after a wound like that. But an old Indian came out of the bush. When we aimed our guns at him, he made the peace sign and spoke to us in Spanish. Don't know why the boys didn't shoot him in his tracks, because our blood was heated with the fighting and killing, but, well, something about him made us hold our fire. He said he wasn't a Comanche, but was an old friend of Garfield's and wanted to help him.
He asked us to carry Jim into a clump of mesquite and leave him alone with him, and to this day, I don't know why we did, but we did. Oh, that was an awful time. The wounded moaning and calling for water. The staring corpses strewn about the camp, night coming on, and nowhere knowing that the Indians wouldn't return when dark fell. We made camp right there, because the horses were fagged out, and we watched all night, but the Comanches didn't come back. I don't know what went on out in the mesquite where Jim Garfield's body lay, because I never saw that strange Indian again. But during the night I kept hearing a weird moaning that wasn't made by a dying man, and an owl hooted from midnight till dawn. When at sunrise, Jim Garfield came walking out of the mesquite, pale and haggard but alive, and already the wound in his breast had closed and begun to heal. And since then he's never mentioned that wound, nor that fight, nor the strange Indian who came and went so mysteriously. He hasn't aged a bit. He looks now just like he did then, a man of about 50. In the silence that followed, a car began to purr down the road, and twin shafts of light cut through the dust. "That's Doc Blaine," I said. "When I come back, I'll tell you how Garfield is." Doc Blaine was prompt with his predictions as we drove the 3 miles of post-oak-covered hills that lay between Lost Knob and the Garfield farm. "Well, I'll be surprised to see him alive," he said. "Oh, smashed up like he is. A man his age ought to have more sense than to try and break a young horse." "He doesn't look so old," I remarked. "Well, I'll be 50 my next birthday," answered Doc Blaine. "I've known him all my life, and he must have been at least 50 the first time I ever saw him. His looks are deceiving." Old Garfield's dwelling place was reminiscent of the past. The boards of the low squat house had never known paint. Orchard fence and corrals were built of rails. Old Jim lay on his rude bed, tended crudely but efficiently by the man Doc Blaine had hired over the old man's protests. As I looked at him, I was impressed anew by his evident vitality. His frame was stooped but unwithered, his limbs rounded out with springy muscles. In his corded neck and in his face, drawn though it was with suffering, was apparent an innate virility. His eyes, though partly glazed with pain, burned with the same unquenchable element. "He's been raving," said Joe Braxton stolidly. "First white man in this country," muttered old Jim, becoming intelligible. "Hills no white man ever set foot in before. Getting too old. Have to settle down. Can't move on like I used to. Settle down here. Good country before it filled up with cowmen and squatters. I wish you and Cameron could see this country. Why the Mexicans shot him, damn them." Doc Blaine shook his head. "He's all smashed up inside. He won't live till daylight." And Garfield unexpectedly lifted his head and looked at us with clear eyes. "Wrong, Doc," he wheezed, his breath whistling with pain. "Oh, I'll live. What's broken bones and twisted guts? Nothing. It's the heart that counts. As long as the heart keeps pumping, a man can't die. My heart's sound. Listen to it. Feel it." He groped painfully for Doc Blaine's wrist, dragged his hand to his bosom and held it there, staring up into the doctor's face with avid intensity. "Regular dynamo, ain't it?" he gasped. "Stronger than a gasoline engine." Blaine beckoned me. "Lay your hand here," he said, placing my hand on the old man's bare breast. "He does have a remarkable heart action." I noted, in the light of the coal oil lamp, a great livid scar in the gaunt arching breast. Such a scar as might be made by a flint-headed spear. I laid my hand directly on this scar, and an exclamation escaped my lips. Under my old hand, Jim Garfield's heart pulsed, but its throb was like no other heart action I've ever observed. Its power was astounding. His ribs vibrated to its very throb. It felt more like the vibrating of a dynamo than the action of a human organ. I could feel its amazing vitality radiating from his breast, stealing up into my hand and up my arm, until my own heart seemed to speed up in response.
Oh, I can't die, old Jim gasped. Not as long as my heart's in my breast. Only a bullet through the brain can kill me. Even then I wouldn't be rightly dead, as long as my heart keeps beating in my breast. Yet it ain't rightly mine either. It belongs to Ghostman, the Lipan chief. It was the heart of a god the Lipans worshipped before the Comanches drove them out of their native hills. I knew Ghostman down on the Rio Grande. When I was with you and Cameron, I saved his life from the Mexicans once. He tied the string of ghost wampum between him and me, the wampum no man but me and him can see or feel. He came when he knowed I needed him, and I fired up on the headwaters of Locust Creek when I got this scar. Well, I was as dead as a man can be. My heart was sliced in two, like the heart of a butchered beast steer. All night Ghostman did magic, calling my ghost back from Spiritland. I remember that fight a little. It was dark and grey-like, and I drifted through grey mists and heard the dead wailing past me in the mist. But Ghostman brought me back. He took out what was left of my mortal heart and put the heart of the god in my bosom. But it's his, and when I'm through with it, he'll come for it. Kept me alive and strong for the lifetime of a man. Age can't touch me. What do I care if these fools around here call me an old liar? What I know, I know. But hark he. And his fingers became claws, clamping fiercely on Doc Blaine's wrist. His old eyes, old yet strangely young, burned fierce as those of an eagle under his bushy brows. If by some mischance I should die, now or later, promise me this. Go into my bosom and take out the heart Ghostman led me so long ago. It's his, and as long as it beats in my body, my spirit will be tied to that body. Let my head be crushed like an egg underfoot, a living thing in a rotten body. Promise? All right, I promise, replied Doc Blaine to humor him, and old Jim Garfield sank back with a whistling sigh of relief. Well, he did not die that night, nor the next, nor the next. I well remember the next day because that was the day I had the fight with Jack Kirby. Now, people will take a good deal from a bully rather than to spill blood. Because nobody had gone to the trouble of killing him, Kirby thought the whole countryside was afraid of him. He'd bought a steer from my father, and when my father went to collect for it, Kirby told him that he paid the money to me, which was a lie. I went looking for Kirby and came upon him in a bootleg joint, boasting of his toughness and telling the crowd that he was going to beat me up and make me say that he paid me the money, that I had to stick it into my own pocket. When I heard him say that, I saw red, and ran in on him with a stockman's knife and cut him across the face and in the neck, side, breast, and belly. The only thing that saved his life was the fact that the crowd pulled me off. Well, there was a preliminary hearing, and I was indicted on a charge of assault. My trial was set for the following term of court. Now, Kirby was as tough-fibered as a post-oak country bully ought to be, and he recovered, swearing vengeance, for he was vain of his looks, though God knows why, and I had permanently impaired them. While Jack Kirby was recovering, old man Garfield recovered too, to the amazement of everybody, especially Doc Blaine. I well remember the night Doc Blaine took me again out to old Jim Garfield's farm. I was in Shifty Corlin's joint, trying to drink enough of the slop he called beer to get a kick out of it, when Doc Blaine came in and persuaded me to go with him. As we drove along the winding old road in Doc's car, I asked, "Why are you so insistent I go with you on this particular night? This isn't a professional call, is it?" "No," he said. "You couldn't kill old Jim with a post-oak maul. He's completely recovered from injuries that ought to have killed an ox. To tell you the truth, Jack Kirby is in Lost Knob, swearing he'll shoot you on sight." "Well, for God's sake," I exclaimed angrily. "Now everybody'll think I left town because I was afraid of him. Turn around and take me back, damn it." "Be reasonable," said Doc. "Everybody knows you're not afraid of Kirby. Nobody's afraid of him now. His bluff's broken. That's why he's so wild against you.
But you can't afford to have any more trouble with him now. The trial's only a short time off. I laughed and said, well, if he's looking for me hard enough, you can find me as easily at old Garfield's as in town, because Shifty called and heard you say where you were going. Shifty's hated me ever since I skinned him in that horse swap last fall. Yeah, he'll tell Kirby where I went. Never thought of that, said Doc Blaine, worried. Forget it, I advised. Kirby hasn't got guts enough to do anything but blow. But I was mistaken. Puncture a bully's vanity, and you touch his one vital spot. Now, old Jim had not gone to bed when we got there. He was sitting in the room opening onto his sagging porch, the room which was at once living room and bedroom, smoking his old cob pipe and trying to read a newspaper by the light of his coal oil lamp. All the windows and doors were wide open for the coolness, and the insects which swarmed in and fluttered around the lamp didn't seem to bother him. We sat down and discussed the weather, which isn't so insane as one might suppose in a country where men's livelihood depends on sun and rain, and is at the mercy of wind and drought. The talk drifted into other kindred channels, and after some time, Doc Blaine bluntly spoke of something that hung in his mind. "Jim," he said, "at night I thought you were dying. You babbled a lot of stuff about your heart, and an Indian who lent you his. How much of that was delirium?" "None, Doc," said Garfield, pulling at his pipe. "It was gospel truth. Ghostman, the Lipan priest of the gods of night, replaced my dead, torn heart with one from something he worshipped. I ain't sure myself just what something is. Well, something from way back, a long way off, he said. But being a god, he can do without his heart for a while. But when I die, if I ever get my head smashed so my consciousness is destroyed, the heart must be given back to Ghostman." "You mean you were in earnest about cutting out your heart?" demanded Doc Blaine. "Oh, it has to be," answered old Garfield. "A living thing and a dead thing is opposed to nature. That's what Ghostman said." Who the devil was Ghostman? Well, I told you, a witch doctor of the Lipans who dwelt in this country before the Comanches came down from the State Plains and drove them south across the Rio Grande. I was a friend to him. I reckon a Ghostman is the only one left alive. Alive? Now? I don't know, confessed old Jim. I don't know whether he's alive or dead. I don't know whether he was alive when he came to me after the fight on Locust Creek, or even if he was alive when I knowed him in the southern country. Alive as we understand life, I mean. God, what balderdash is this? Demanded Doc Blaine uneasily, and I felt a slight stirring in my hair. Outside was stillness and the stars, and the black shadows of the post oak woods. The lamp cast old Garfield's shadow grotesquely on the wall, so it didn't at all resemble that of a human, and his words were strange as words heard in a nightmare. "I know what you wouldn't understand," said old Jim. "I don't understand myself, and I ain't got the words to explain them things I feel and know without understanding. The Lapans were kin to the Apaches, and the Apaches learned curious things from the Pueblos. Ghostman was, that's all I can say. Alive or dead, I don't know, but he was. What's more, he is." "Oh, is it you or me that's crazy?" asked Doc Blaine. "Well," said old Jim, "I'll tell you this much. Ghostman knew Coronado." "Crazy as a loon," murmured Doc Blaine. Then he lifted his head. "What's that?" "Horse turning in from the road," I said. "Sounds like it stopped." I stepped to the door, like a fool, and stood etched in the light behind me. I got a glimpse of a shadowy bulk I knew to be a man on a horse. Then Doc Blaine yelled, "Look out!" and threw himself against me, knocking us both sprawling. At the same instant I heard the smashing report of a rifle, and old Garfield grunted and fell heavily. "Jack Kirby!" screamed Doc Blaine. "He's killed him!" I scrambled up, hearing the clatter of retreating hooves. snatched old Jim's shotgun from the wall, rushed recklessly out onto the sagging porch, and let go both barrels at the fleeing shape, dim in the starlight. The charge was too light to kill at that range, but the birdshot stung the horse and maddened him. He swerved, crashed headlong through a rail fence, and charged across the orchard, and a peach tree limb knocked his rider out of the saddle. He never moved after he hit the ground. I ran up there and looked down at him. It was Jack Kirby right enough, and his neck was broken like a rotten branch. I let him lie and ran back to the house. Doc Blaine had stretched old Garfield out on a bench he'd dragged in from the porch. Doc's face was whiter than I'd ever seen it. Old Jim was a ghastly sight. He'd been shot with an old-fashioned .45-70, and at that range the heavy ball had literally torn off the top of his head. His features were masked with blood and brains. He'd been directly behind me, poor old devil, and he'd stopped the slug meant for me. Doc Blaine was trembling, although he was anything but a stranger to such sights. "Would you pronounce him dead?" he asked. "That's for you to say," I answered. "But even a fool could tell that he is dead." "He is dead," said Doc Blaine in a strained, unnatural voice. "Rigor mortis is already setting in, but feel his heart." I did, and I cried out. The flesh was already cold and clammy, but beneath it, that mysterious heart still hammered away steadily, like a dynamo in a deserted house. No blood coursed through those veins, and yet the heart pounded, pounded and pounded, like the pulse of eternity. "A living thing in a dead thing," whispered Doc Blaine, cold sweat on his face. "This is opposed to nature. I'm going to keep the promise I made him. I'll assume full responsibility. This is too monstrous to ignore." Our implements were a butcher knife and a hacksaw. Outside, only the still stars looked down on the black post oak shadows and the dead man that lay in the orchard. Inside, the old lamp flickered, making strange shadows move and shiver and cringe in the corners, and glistened on the blood on the floor, and the red dabbled figure on the bench. The only sound inside was the crunch of the saw edge on bone. Outside, an owl began to hoot weirdly. Doc Blaine thrust a red-stained hand into the aperture he'd made and drew out a red, pulsing object that caught the lamplight. With a choked cry, he recoiled, and the thing slipped from his fingers and fell on the table. And I, too, cried out involuntarily. For it did not fall with a soft, meaty thud, as a piece of flesh should fall. It thumped hard on the table. Impelled by an irresistible urge, I bent and gingerly picked up old Garfield's heart. The feel of it was brittle, unyielding, like steel or stone, but smoother than either. In size and shape, it was a duplicate of a human heart, but it was slick and smooth, and its crimson surface reflected the lamplight like a jewel more lambent than any ruby, and in my hand it still throbbed mightily, sending vibratory radiations of energy up my arm until my own heart seemed swelling and bursting in response. It was cosmic power, beyond my comprehension, concentrated into the likeness of a human heart. The thought came to me that here was a dynamo of life, the nearest approach to immortality that's possible for the destructible human body, the materialization of a cosmic secret more wonderful than the fabulous fountain sought for by Ponce de Leon. My soul was drawn into that unterrestrial gleam, and I suddenly wished passionately that it hammered and thundered in my own bosom in place of my paltry heart of tissue and muscle. Doc Blaine ejaculated incoherently. I wheeled. The noise of his coming had been no greater than the whispering of a night wind through the corn. There in the doorway he stood, tall, dark, inscrutable, an Indian warrior in the paint, war bonnet, breech clout and moccasins of an elder age. His dark eyes burned like fires gleaming deep under fathomless black lakes. Silently he extended his hand, and I dropped Jim Garfield's heart into it. And then, without a word, he turned and stalked into the night. But when Dot Blaine and I rushed out into the yard an instant later, there was no sign of any human being. He'd vanished like a phantom of the night, and only something that looked like an owl was flying, dwindling from sight into the rising moon. The abominations of Yondo. The sand of the desert of Yondo is not as the sand of other deserts, for Yondo lies nearest of all to the world's rim, and strange winds blowing from a pit no astronomer may hope to fathom have sown its ruinous fields with the grey dust of corroding planets, the black ashes of extinguished suns. The dark, orb-like mountains which rise from its wrinkled and pitted plain are not all its own, the sum of fallen asteroids half buried in that abysmal sand. Things have crept in from nether space, whose incursion is forbid by the gods of all proper and well-ordered lands, but there are no such gods in Yondo, where live the hoary genii of stars abolished and decrepit demons left homeless by the destruction of antiquated hells. It was noon of a vernal day when I came forth from that interminable cactus forest in which the inquisitors of Ong had left me, and saw at my feet the grey beginnings of Yondo. I repeat, it was noon on a vernal day, but in that fantastic wood I'd found no token or memory of a spring, and the swollen, fulvous, dying and half-rotten growths through which I'd pushed my way were like no other cacti, but rather bore shapes of abomination scarcely to be described. The very air was heavy with stagnant odours of decay, and leprous lichens mottled the black soil and russet vegetation with increasing frequency. Pale green vipers lifted their heads from prostrate cactus bowls, and watched me with eyes of bright ochre that had no lids or pupils. These things had disquieted me for hours past, and I did not like the monstrous fungi with hueless stems and nodding heads of poisonous mauve, which grew from the sodden lips of fetid tarns, and the sinister ripples spreading and fading on the yellow water at my approach were not reassuring to one whose nerves were still taut from unmentionable tortures. Then, when even the blotched and sickly cacti became more sparse and stunted, and rills of ash and sand crept in among them, I began to suspect how great was the hatred my heresy had aroused in the priests of Ong, and to guess the ultimate malignancy of their vengeance. I will not detail the indiscretions which had led me, a careless stranger from far-off lands, into the power of those dreadful magicians and mysteriacs who serve the lion-headed Ong. These indiscretions and the particulars of my arrest are painful to remember, and least of all do I like to remember the racks of dragon guts strewn with powdered adamant, on which men have stretched naked, or that unlit room with 6-inch windows near the sill, where bloated corpse worms crawled in by the hundreds from a neighbouring catacomb. Sufficient to say that, after expending the resources of their frightful fantasy, my inquisitors had borne me blindfolded on camelback for incomputable hours, to leave me at morning twilight in that sinister forest. I was free, they told me, to go whither I would, and in token of the clemency of Ong, they gave me a loaf of coarse bread and a leathern bottle of rank water by way of provision. It was of noon that same day that I came to the desert of Yondo. So far I had not thought of turning back, for all the horror of those rotting cacti or the evil things that dwelt among them. But now I paused, knowing the abominable legend of the land to which I had come, for Yondo is a place where few have ventured wittingly and of their own accord. Fewer still have returned, babbling of unknown horrors and strange treasure, and the lifelong palsy which shakes their withered limbs, together with the mad gleam in their startling eyes, beneath whitened brows and lashes, is not an incentive for others to follow. So it was that I hesitated on the verge of those ashen sands, and felt the tremor of a new fear in my wrenched vitals. It was dreadful to go on, and dreadful to go back, for I felt sure that the priests had made provision against the latter contingency. So after a little while, I went forward, singing at each step in loathly softness, and followed by certain long-legged insects that I'd met among the cacti. These insects were the colour of a week-old corpse, and were as large as tarantulas. But when I turned and trod upon the foremost, a mephitic stench arose that was more nauseous even than their colour. So, for the nonce, I ignored them as much as possible. Indeed, such things were minor horrors in my predicament. Before me, under a huge sun of sickly scarlet, yonder reached interminable as the land of a hashish stream against the black heavens. Far off, on the utmost rim, were those orb-like mountains of which I'd been told. But in between were awful blanks of grey desolation, and low, treeless hills like the backs of half-buried monsters. Struggling on, I saw great pits where meteors had sunk from sight, and diverse coloured jewels that I could not name glared or glistened from the dust. There were fallen cypresses that rotted by crumbling mausoleums, on whose lichen-blotted marble fat chameleons crept with royal pearls in their mouths. Hidden by the low ridges were cities of which no stela remained unbroken, immense and immemorial cities lapsing shard by shard, atom by atom, to feed infinities of desolation. I dragged my torture-weakened limbs over vast rubbish heaps that had once been mighty temples, and fallen gods frowned in rotting passamite, or leered in riven porphyry at my feet. Over all was an evil silence, broken only by the satanic laughter of hyenas and the rustling of adders in thickets of dead thorn or antique gardens given to the perishing nettle and fumitory. Topping one of the many mound-like ridges, I saw the waters of a weird lake, unfathomably dark and green as malachite, and set with bars of refulgent salt. These waters lay far beneath me in a cup-like hollow, but almost at my feet on the wave-worn slopes were heaps of that ancient salt, and I knew that the lake was only the bitter and ebbing dregs of some former sea. Climbing down, I came to the dark waters, and began to lave my hands, but there was a sharp and corrosive sting in that immemorial brine, and I desisted quickly, preferring the desert dust that had wrapped me about like a slow shroud. Here, I decided to rest for a while, and hunger forced me to consume part of the meagre and mocking fare with which I had been provided by the priests. It was my intention to push on if my strength would allow, and reach the lands that lie to the north of yonder. Now, these lands are desolate indeed, but their desolation is of a more usual than that of yonder, and certain tribes of nomads have been known to visit them occasionally. If fortune favoured me, I might fall in with one of these tribes. Well, the scant fare revived me, and for the first time in weeks of which I had lost all reckoning, I heard the whisper of a faint hope. Corpse-coloured insects had long since ceased to follow me, and so far, despite the eeriness of the sepulchral silence and the mounded dust of timeless ruin, I had met nothing half so horrible as those insects. I began to think that the terrors of yonder were somewhat exaggerated. It was then that I heard a diabolic chuckle on the hillside above me. The sound began with a sharp abruptness that startled me beyond all reason, and continued endlessly, never varying its single note, like the mirth of an idiotic demon. I turned and saw the mouth of a dark cave, fanged with green stalactites, which I had not perceived before. The sound appeared to come from within this cave. With a fearful intentness, I stared at the black opening. The chuckle grew louder, but for a while I could see nothing. At last I caught a whitish glimmer in the darkness. Then, with all the rapidity of nightmare, a monstrous thing emerged. It had a pale, hairless, egg-shaped body, large as that of a gravid she-goat, and this body was mounted on 9 long, wavering legs with many flanges, like the legs of some enormous spider. The creature ran past me to the water's edge, and I saw that there were no eyes in its oddly sloping face, but 2 knife-like ears rose high above its head, and a thin, wrinkled snout hung down across its mouth, whose flabby lips, parted in that eternal chuckle, revealed rows of bat's teeth. It drank acidly of the bitter lake. Then, With thirst satisfied, it turned and seemed to sense my presence, for the wrinkled snout rose and pointed toward me, sniffing audibly. Whether the creature would have fled, or whether it meant to attack me, I do not know, for I could bear the sight no longer, but ran with trembling limbs amid the massive boulders and great bars of salt along the lake shore. Utterly breathless, I stopped at last, and saw that I was not pursued. I sat down, still trembling, in the shadow of a boulder. But I was to find little respite, for now began the second of those bizarre adventures which forced me to believe all the mad legends I had heard. More startling even than that diabolic chuckle was a scream that rose at my very elbow from the salt-compounded sand. The scream of a woman possessed by some atrocious agony, or helpless in the grip of devil. Turning, I beheld a veritable Venus, naked in a white perfection that could fear no scrutiny, but immersed to her navel in the sand. Her terror-widened eyes implored me, and her lotus hands reached out with beseeching gesture. I sprang to her side and touched a marble statue whose carved lips were drooped in some enigmatic dream of dead cycles, and whose hands were buried with the lost loveliness of hips and thighs. Again I fled, shaken with a new fear, and again I heard the scream of a woman's agony. But this time I did not turn to see the imploring eyes and hands. Up the long slope to the north of that accursed lake, stumbling over boulders of basanite and ledges that were sharp with verdigris-covered metals, floundering in pits of salt, on terraces wrought by the receding tide in ancient eons, I fled as a man flies from dream to baleful dream of some cocodemonical night. But whilst there was a cold whisper in my ear, which did not come from the wind of my flight. And looking back, as I reached one of the upper terraces, I perceived a singular shadow that ran pace by pace with my own. This shadow was not the shadow of man or ape nor any beast. Now, the head was too grotesquely elongated, the squat body too gibbous, and I was unable to determine whether the shadow possessed 5 legs or whether what appeared to be the 5th was merely a tail. Terror lent me new strength, and I'd reached the hilltop when I dared to look back again. But still the fantastic shadow kept pace by pace with mine, and now I caught a curious and utterly sickening odour, as foul as the odour of bats who've hung in a charnel house amid the mould of corruption. I ran for leagues, while the red sun slanted above the asteroidal mountains to the west, and the weird shadow lengthened with mine, but always kept at the same distance behind me. An hour before sunset I came to a small circle of pillars that rose miraculously unbroken amid ruins that were like a vast pile of potsherds. As I passed among these pillars, I heard a whimper, like the whimper of some fierce animal, between rage and fear, and saw that the shadow had not followed me within the circle. I stopped and waited, conjecturing at once that I'd found a sanctuary my unwelcome familiar would not dare to enter, and in this the action of the shadow confirmed me. The thing hesitated, then ran about the circle of columns, pausing often between them, and whimpering all the while, at last went away and disappeared in the desert toward the setting sun. For a full half-hour I did not dare to move. Then the imminence of night, with all its probabilities of fresh terror, urged me to push on as far as I could to the north. For I was now in the very heart of yonder where demons or phantoms might dwell, who would not respect the sanctuary of the unbroken columns. Now, as I toiled on, the sunlight altered strangely, for the red orb nearing the mounded horizon sank and smouldered in a belt of miasmal haze, where floating dust from all the shattered fanes and necropoli of yonder was mixed with evil vapours coiling skyward from the black, enormous gulfs lying beyond the utmost rim of the world. In that light, the entire waste, the rounded mountains, the serpentine hills, the lost cities were all drenched with phantasmal and darkening scarlet. Then, out of the north, where shadows mustered, there came a curious figure, a tall man, fully caparisoned in chainmail, or rather, what I assumed to be a man. As the figure approached me, clanking dismally at each step on the shrouded ground. I saw that his armour was of brass mottled with verdigris, and a casque of the same metal furnished with coiling horns and a serrate cone rose high above its head. Now, I say its head, for the sunset was darkening, and I could not clearly see at any distance. But when the apparition came abreast, I perceived that there was no face beneath the brows of the bizarre helmet, whose empty edges were outlined for a moment against the smouldering light. Then the figure passed on, still clanking dismally, and vanished. But on its heels, the sunset faded. There came a second apparition, striding with incredible strides and halting when it loomed almost upon me in the red twilight. The monstrous mummy of some ancient king, still crowned with untarnished gold, but turning to my gaze a visage that more than time or the worm had wasted. Broken swathings flapped about the skeleton legs, and above the crown that was set with sapphires and orange rubies, a black something swayed and nodded horribly. But for an instant, I did not dream what it was. Then, in its middle, two oblique and scarlet eyes opened and glowed like hellish coals, and two ophidian fangs glittered in an ape-like mouth. A squat, furless, shapeless head on a neck of disproportionate extent leaned unspeakably down and whispered in the mummy's ear. Then, with one stride, the titanic leg took off the distance between us, and from out the folds of the tattered cerecloth a gaunt arm rose, and fleshless, taloned fingers laden with glowing gems reached out and fumbled for my throat. Back through eons of madness and dread, in a prone, precipitate flight, I ran from those fumbling fingers that hung always on the dust behind me. Back forever, unthinking, unhesitating, to all the abominations I had left. Back in the thickening twilight toward the nameless and sharded ruins, the haunted lake, the forest of evil cacti, and the cruel, the cynical inquisitors of Ong, who waited my return.
I've seldom been able to resist the allurement of a bookstore, particularly one that's well supplied with rare and exotic items. Therefore I turned in at Tolman's to browse around for a few minutes. I'd come to San Francisco for one of my brief biannual visits and had started early that idle forenoon to an appointment with Cyprian Cincoll, a sculptor, a second or third cousin of mine, whom I'd not seen for several years. The studio was only a block from Tolman's, and there seemed to be no especial object in reaching it ahead of time. Cyprian had offered to show me his collection of recent sculptures, but remembering the smooth mediocrity of his former work, amid which there were a few banal efforts to achieve horror and grotesquerie, I did not anticipate anything more than an hour or two of dismal boredom. The little shop was empty of customers. Knowing my proclivities, the owner and his one assistant became tacitly non-attentive after a word of recognition, and left me to rummage at will among the curiously laden shelves. Wedged in between other but less alluring titles, I found a luxury edition of Goya's Proverbs. I began to turn the heavy pages and was soon engrossed in the diabolic art of these nightmare-nurtured drawings. It had always been incomprehensible to me that I did not shriek aloud with mindless, overmastering terror when I happened to look up from the volume and saw the thing that was crouching in a corner of the bookshelves before me. I could not have been more hideously startled if some hellish conception of Goya had suddenly come to life and emerged from one of the pictures in the folio. What I saw was a forward-slouching, vermin-grey figure, wholly devoid of hair or down or bristles, but marked with faint, etiolated rings like those of a serpent that has lived in darkness. It possessed the head and brow of an anthropoid ape, a semi-canine mouth and jaw, and arms ending in twisted hands whose black hyena talons nearly scraped the floor. The thing was infinitely bestial, and at the same time macabre, for its parchment skin had shriveled, corpse-like, mummified in a manner impossible to convey, and from eye sockets well-nigh deep as those of a skull, there glimmered evil slits of yellowish phosphorescence, like burning sulphur. Fangs that were stained as if with poison or gangrene issued from the slavering, half-open mouth, and the whole attitude of the creature was that of some maleficent monster in readiness to spring. Though I had been for years a professional writer of stories that often dealt with occult phenomena, with the weird and the spectral, I was not at this time possessed of any clear and settled belief regarding such phenomena. I had never before seen anything that I could identify as a phantom, nor even an hallucination, and I should hardly have said offhand that a bookstore on a busy street in full summer daylight was the likeliest places to see one. But the thing before me was assuredly nothing that could ever exist among the permissible forms of a sane world. It was too horrific, too atrocious to be anything but a creation of unreality. Even as I stared across the Goya, sick with half-incredulous fear, the apparition moved toward me. Well, I say that it moved, but its change of position was so instantaneous, so utterly without effort or visible transition, that the verb is hopelessly inadequate. The foul spectre had seemed 5 or 6 feet away, but now it was stooping directly above the volume that I held in my hands, with its loathsomely lambent eyes peering upward at my face, and a grey-green slime drooling from its mouth on the broad pages. At the same time I breathed an insupportable fetor, like a mingling of rancid serpent stench with the mouldiness of antique charnels and the fearsome reek of newly decaying carrion. In a frozen timelessness that was perhaps no more than a second or two, my heart appeared to suspend its beating, while I beheld the ghastly face. Gasping, I let the Goya drop with a resonant bang on the floor, and even as it fell, I saw that the vision had vanished. Tolman, a tonsured gnome with shell-rimmed goggles, rushed forward to retrieve the fallen volume, exclaiming, "What is wrong, Mr. Hestane? Are you ill?" From the meticulousness with which he examined the binding in search of possible damage, I knew that his chief solicitude was concerning the Goya. It was plain that neither he nor his clerk had seen the phantom, nor could I detect aught in their manner to indicate that they had noticed the mephitic odour that still lingered in the air, like an exhalation from broken graves. And, as far as I could tell, they did not even perceive the greyish slime that still polluted the open folio. I do not remember how I managed to make my exit from the shop. My mind had become a seething blur of muddled horror, of crawling, sick revulsion from the supernatural vileness I had beheld, together with the direst apprehension for my own sanity and safety. I recall only that I found myself on the street above Tolman's, walking with feverish rapidity toward my cousin's studio, with a neat parcel containing the Goya volume under my arm. Evidently, in my effort to atone for my clumsiness, I must have bought and paid for the book by a sort of automatic impulse, without any real awareness of what I was doing. I came to the building in which was my destination, but went on around the block several times before entering. All the while I fought desperately to regain my self-control and equipoise. I remember how difficult it was to moderate the pace at which I was walking, or refrain from breaking into a run. It seemed to me that I was fleeing all the time from an invisible pursuer. I tried to argue with myself to convince the rational part of my mind that the apparition had been the product of some evanescent trick of light and shade, or a temporary dimming of eyesight. But such sophistries were useless, for I'd seen the gargoylish terror all too distinctly, in an unforgettable fullness of grisly detail. What could the thing mean? I'd never used narcotic drugs or abused alcohol. My nerves, as far as I knew, were in sound condition. But either I'd suffered a visual hallucination that might mark the beginning of some obscure cerebral disorder, or had been visited by a spectral phenomenon, by something from the realms and dimensions that are past the normal scope of human perception. It was a problem either for the alienist or the occultist. Though I was still damnably upset, I contrived to regain a nominal composure of my faculties. Also, it occurred to me that the unimaginative portrait busts and tamely symbolic figure groups of Cyprian and Sincal might serve admirably to soothe my shaken nerves.
Even his grotesques would seem sane and ordinary by comparison with the blasphemous gargoyle that had drooled before me in the bookshop. I entered the studio building and climbed a worn stairway to the second floor, where Cyprian had established himself in a somewhat capacious suite of rooms. As I went up the stairs, I had the peculiar feeling that somebody was climbing them just ahead of me, but I could neither see nor hear anyone, and the hall above was no less silent and empty than the stairs. Cyprian was in his atelier when I knocked. After an interval which seemed unduly long, I heard him call out, telling me to enter. I found him wiping his hands on an old cloth, and surmised that he'd been modelling. A sheet of light burlap had been thrown over what was plainly an ambitious but unfinished group of figures, which occupied the centre of the long room. All around were other sculptures in clay, bronze, marble, and even the terracotta and steatite which he sometimes employed for his less conventional conceptions. At one end of the room there stood a heavy Chinese screen. At a single glance I realized that a great change had occurred, both in Cyprian Sincoll and his work. I remembered him as an amiable, somewhat flabby-looking youth, always dapperly dressed with no trace of the dreamer or visionary. It was hard to recognize him now, for he had become lean, harsh, vehement, with an air of pride and penetration that was almost Luciferian. His unkempt mane of hair was already shot with white, and his eyes were electrically brilliant with a strange knowledge, and yet somehow they were vaguely furtive, as if there dwelt behind them a morbid and macabre fear. The change in his sculptures was no less striking. The respectable tameness and polished mediocrity were gone, and in their place, incredibly, was something little short of genius. More unbelievable still, in view of the laboriously ordinary grotesques of his earlier phase, was the trend that his art had now taken. All around me were frenetic, murderous demons, satyrs mad with nympholepsy, ghouls that seemed to sniff the odours of the charnel, lamias voluptuously coiled about their victims, and less nameable things that belonged to the outland realms of evil myth and malign superstition. Sin, horror, blasphemy, diablerie, the lust and malice of pandemonium, all had been caught with impeccable art. The potent nightmarishness of these creations was not calculated to reassure my trembling nerves, and all at once I felt an imperative desire to escape from the studio, to flee from the baleful throng of frozen cacodemons and chiseled chimeras. My expression must have betrayed my feelings to some extent. "Pretty strong work, aren't they?" said Cyprian in a loud, vibrant voice with a note of harsh pride and triumph. "I can see that you're surprised. You didn't look for anything of the sort, I dare say." "No, candidly I didn't," I admitted. "Good Lord, man, you will become the Michelangelo of diabolism if you go on at this rate. Where on earth do you get such stuff?" "Yes, I've gone pretty far," said Cyprian, seeming to disregard my question. "Further even than you think, probably. If you could know what I know, could see what I have seen, you might make something really worthwhile out of your weird fiction, Philip. You are very clever and imaginative, of course, but you've never had any experience." Well, I was startled and puzzled. "Experience? What do you mean?" "Precisely that. You try to depict the occult and the supernatural without even the most rudimentary first-hand knowledge of them. I tried to do something of the same sort in sculpture years ago, without knowledge, and doubtless you recall the mediocre mess that I made of it, but I've learned a thing or two since then." "Sounds as if you made the traditional bond with the devil, or something of the sort," I observed with a feeble and perfunctory levity. Cyprian's eyes narrowed slightly, with a strange, secret look. "I know what I know. Never mind how or what. The world in which we live isn't the only world, and some of the others lie closer at hand than you think. The boundaries of the seen and the unseen are sometimes interchangeable." Recalling the malevolent phantom, I felt a peculiar disquietude as I listened to his words. An hour before, his statement would have impressed me as mere theorizing, but now it assumed an ominous and terrifying significance.
What makes you think I have no experience of the occult? I asked.
Well, your stories hardly show anything of the kind. Anything factual or personal. They are all palpably made up. When you've argued with a ghost, or watched the ghouls at mealtime, or fought with an incubus, or suckled a vampire, you may achieve some genuine characterization and color along such lines. Well, for reasons that should be fairly obvious, I had not intended to tell anyone of the unbelievable thing at Tolman's. Now, with a singular mixture of emotions, of compulsive, eerie terrors, and desire to refute the animadversions of Cyprian, I found myself describing the phantom. He listened with an inexpressive look, as if his thoughts were occupied with other matters than my story. Then, when I'd finished,
You're becoming more psychic than I imagined.
Was your apparition anything like one of these? With the last words, he lifted the sheet of burlap from the muffled group of figures beside which he'd been standing. I cried out involuntarily with the shock of that appalling revelation, and almost tottered as I stepped back. Before me, in a monstrous semicircle, were 7 creatures who might all have been modelled from the gargoyle that had confronted me across the folio of Goya drawings. Even in several that were still amorphous and incomplete, Cyprian had conveyed with a damnable art the peculiar mingling of primal bestiality and mortuary putrescence that had signalled the phantom. The 7 monsters had closed in on a cowering, naked girl, and were all clutching foully toward her with their hyena claws. The stark, frantic, insane terror on the face of the girl, and the slavering hunger of her assailants, were alike unbearable. The group was a masterpiece, in its consummate power of technique, but a masterpiece that inspired loathing rather than admiration. And following my recent experience, the sight of it affected me with indescribable alarm. It seemed to me that I'd gone astray from the normal, familiar world into a land of detestable mystery, of prodigious and unnatural menace. Held by an abhorrent fascination, it was hard for me to wrench my eyes away from the figure-piece. At last, I turned from it to Cyprian himself. He was regarding me with a cryptic air, beneath which I suspected a covert gloating.
"How do you like my little pets?"
he inquired. "I'm going to call the composition
The Hunters from Beyond."
Before I could answer, a woman suddenly appeared from behind the Chinese screen. I saw that she was the model for the girl in the unfinished group. Evidently she'd been dressing, and she was now ready to leave, for she wore a tailored suit and a smart toque. She was beautiful, in a dark, semi-Latin fashion, but her mouth was sullen and reluctant, and her wide liquid eyes were wells of strange terror as she gazed at Cyprian, myself, and the uncovered statue piece. Cyprian did not introduce me. He and the girl talked together in low tones for a minute or two, and I was unable to overhear more than half of what they said. I gathered, however, that an appointment was being made for the next sitting. There was a pleading, frightened tone in the girl's voice, together with an almost maternal concern, and Cyprian seemed to be arguing with her, or trying to reassure her about something. At last she went out, with a clear, supplicative glance at me, a glance whose meaning I could only surmise, and could not wholly fathom. "That was Marta," said Cyprian. "She's half Irish, half Italian. Good model, but my new sculptures seem to be making her a little nervous." He laughed abruptly with a mirthless, jarring note that was like the cachinnation of a sorcerer.
"Oh, in God's name, what are you trying to do here?"
I burst out.
"What does it all mean?
Do such abominations really exist on Earth or in any hell?" He laughed once again, with an evil subtlety, and became evasive all at once. "Anything may exist in a boundless universe with multiple dimensions. Anything may be real or unreal. Who knows? It's not for me to say. Figure it out for yourself if you can. There's a vast field for speculation, and perhaps more than speculation." With this, he began immediately to talk of other topics. Baffled, mystified, with a sorely troubled mind and nerves that were more unstrung than ever by the black enigma of it all, I ceased to question him. Simultaneously, my desire to leave the studio became almost overwhelming, a mindless whirlwind panic that prompted me to run pell-mell from the room and down the stairs into the wholesome normality of the common 20th century streets. It seemed to me that the rays which fell through the skylights were not those of the sun, but of some darker orb, that the room was touched with unclean webs of shadow where shadow should not have been, that the stone satans, the bronze lamias, the terracotta satyrs, and the clay gargoyles had somehow increased in number, and might spring to malignant life at any instant. Hardly knowing what I said, I continued to converse for a while with Cyprian. Then, excusing myself on the score of a non-existent luncheon appointment, and promising vaguely to return for another visit before my departure to the city, I took my leave. I was surprised to find my cousin's model in the lower hall, at the foot of the stairway. From her manner and her first words, it was plain that she had been waiting. "You're Mr. Philip Hastane, aren't you?" she said in an eager, agitated voice. "I'm Martha Fitzgerald. Cyprian's often mentioned you, and I believe he admires you a lot." "Maybe you'll think I'm crazy," she went on, "but I had to speak to you. I can't stand the way that things are going here, and I'd refuse to come to the place anymore if it wasn't that I like Cyprian so much. I don't know what he's done, but he's altogether different from what he used to be. His new work is so horrible. You can't imagine how it frightens me. The sculptures he does are more hideous, more hellish all the time. Ugh, those drooling dead grey monsters in that new group of his. I can hardly bear to be in the studio with them. It isn't right for anyone to depict such things. Don't you think they're awful, Mr. Hastane? They look as if they broke loose from hell, make you think that hell can't be very far away. It is wrong and wicked for anyone to even imagine them, and I wish that Cyprian would stop. I'm afraid that something will happen to him, something terrible, to his mind if he goes on, and I'll go mad too if I have to see those monsters many more times. My God, no one could keep sane in that studio." She paused and appeared to hesitate. Then, "Can't you do something, Mr. Hastane? Can't you talk with him and tell him how wrong it is and how dangerous to his mental health? You must have a lot of influence with Cyprian. I mean, you are his cousin, aren't you? Oh, and he thinks you are very clever, too. Oh, I wouldn't ask you if I hadn't been forced to notice so many things that aren't as they should be. I wouldn't bother you either if I knew anyone else to ask. He shut himself up in that awful studio for the past year, and he hardly ever sees anybody. You're the first person he's invited to see his new sculptures. He wants them to be a complete surprise for the critics and the public when he holds his next exhibition. You'll speak to Cyprian, won't you, Mr. Hastane? I can't do anything to stop him. He seems to exult in the mad horrors he creates, and he merely laughs at me when I try to tell him the danger. However, I think that those things are making him a little nervous sometimes, that he's growing afraid of his own morbid imagination. Perhaps he'll listen to you." Well, if I'd needed anything more to unnerve me, the desperate pleading of the girl and her dark, obscurely baleful hintings wouldn't have been enough. I could see that she loved Cyprian, that she was frantically anxious concerning him, and hysterically afraid. Otherwise she would not have approached an utter stranger in this fashion. "But I haven't any influence with Cyprian," I protested, feeling a queer embarrassment. "And what am I to say to mine? His new sculptures are magnificent, and I've never seen anything more powerful of the kind. And how could I advise him to stop doing them? I mean, there would be no legitimate reason. He would simply laugh me out of the studio. An artist has the right to choose his own subject matter, even if he takes it from the nether pits of limbo and Erebus." Well, the girl must have pleaded and argued with me for many minutes in that deserted hall. Listening to her and trying to convince her of my inability to fulfill her request was like a dialogue in some futile and tedious nightmare. During the course of it, she told me a few details that I am unwilling to record in this narrative, details that were too morbid and too shocking for belief. regarding the mental alteration of Cyprian, and his new subject matter and method of work. They were direct and oblique hints of a growing perversion, but somehow it seemed that much more was being held back, that even in her most horrifying disclosures she was not wholly frank with me. At last, with some sort of hazy promise that I would speak to Cyprian, that I'd remonstrate with him, I succeeded in getting away from her and returned to my hotel. The afternoon and evening that followed were tinged as by the tyrannous adumbration of an ill dream. I felt that I'd stepped from the solid earth into a gulf of seething, menacing, madness-haunted shadow, and was lost henceforward to all rightful sense of location or direction. It was all too hideous and too doubtful and unreal. The change in Cyprian himself was no less bewildering, and hardly less horrifying than the vile phantom of the bookshop, and the demon sculptures that displayed a magisterial art. It was as if the man had become possessed by some satanic energy or entity. Everywhere that I went, I was powerless to shake off the feeling of an intangible pursuit, of a frightful, unseen vigilance. It seemed to me that the worm-grey face and sulphurous eyes would reappear at any moment, that the semi-canine mouth with its gangrene-dripping fangs might come to slaver above the restaurant table at which I ate, or upon the pillow of my bed. I did not dare reopen the purchased Goya volume, for fear of finding that certain pages were still defiled with a spectral slime. I went out and spent the evening in cafes, theatres, wherever people thronged and the lights were bright. It was after midnight when I finally ventured to brave the solitude of my hotel bedroom. Then there were the endless hours of nerve-wrung insomnia, of shivering, sweating apprehension beneath the electric bulb that I had left burning. Finally, a little before dawn, by no conscious transition and with no premonitory drowsiness, I fell asleep. I remember no dreams, only the vast incubus-like oppression that persisted even in the depth of slumber, as if to drag me down with its formless, ever-clinging weight into gulfs beyond the reach of created flight or the fathoming of organized entity. It was almost noon when I awoke. I found myself staring into the verminous, apish, mummy-dead face and hell-illumined eyes of the gargoyle that had crouched before me in the corner of Tolman's. The thing was standing at the foot of my bed, and behind it, as I stared, the wall of the room, which was covered with a floral paper, dissolved in an infinite vista of greyness, teeming with ghoulish forms that emerged like monstrous misshapen bubbles from plains of ulgulant ooze and skies of serpentine vapour. It was another world, and my very sense of equilibrium was disturbed by an evil vertigo as I gazed. It seemed to me that my bed was heaving dizzily, was turning slowly, deliriously toward the gulf, that the feculent vista and the vile apparition were swimming beneath me, that I would fall toward them in another moment and be precipitated forever into that world of abysmal monstrosity and obscenity. In a start of profound alarm, I fought my vertigo, fought the sense that another world than mine was drawing me, that the unclean gargoyle was luring me by some unspeakable mesmeric spell, as a serpent is said to lure its prey. I seemed to read a nameless purpose in its yellow-slitted eyes, in the soundless moving of its oozy lips. My very soul recoiled with nausea and revulsion as I breathed its pestilential fetor. Apparently, the mere effort of mental resistance was enough. The vista and the face receded. They went out in a swirl of daylight. I saw the design of tea roses on the wallpaper beyond, and the bed beneath me was sanely horizontal once more. I lay sweating with my terror, all adrift on a nightmare surmise of unearthly threat and whirlpool madness, till the ringing of the telephone bell recalled me automatically to the known world. I sprang to answer the call. It was Cyprian, though I should hardly have recognized the dead, hopeless tones of his voice, from which the mad pride and self-assurance of the previous day had wholly vanished. "I must see you at once," he said. "Can you come to the studio?" I was about to refuse, to tell him that I'd been called home suddenly, that there was no time, that I must catch the noon train, anything to avert the ordeal of another visit to that place of mephitic hell, when I heard his voice again.
"Oh, you simply must come, Philip. I can't tell you about it over the phone. A dreadful thing has happened. Marta has disappeared."
I consented, telling him that I would start for the studio as soon as I dressed. The whole nightmare had closed in, had deepened immeasurably with his last words. But remembering the haunted face of the girl, her hysteric fears, her frantic plea, and my vague promise, I could not very well decline to go. I dressed and went out with my mind in a turmoil of abominable conjecture, of ghastly doubt, and apprehension all the more hideous because I was unsure of its subject. I tried to imagine what had happened, tried to piece together the frightful, evasive, half-admitted hints of an unknown terror into a tangible, coherent fabric, but found myself involved in a chaos of shadowy menace. I couldn't have eaten any breakfast, even if I'd taken the necessary time. I went at once to the studio and found Cyprian standing aimlessly amid his baleful statuary. His look was that of a man who'd been stunned by the blow of some crushing weapon, or has gazed on the very face of Medusa. He greeted me in a vacant manner, with dull, toneless words. Then, like a charged machine, as if his body rather than his mind were speaking, he began at once to pour forth the atrocious narrative.
"They took her," he said simply. "Maybe you didn't know it or weren't sure of it, but I've been doing all my new sculptures from life, even that last group. Marta was posing for me this forenoon, only an hour ago or less. I'd hoped to finish her part of the modeling today, and she wouldn't have had to come again for this particular piece. I hadn't called the things this time, since I knew she was beginning to fear them more and more. Oh, I think she feared them on my account more than her own. They were making me a little uneasy, too, by the boldness with which they sometimes lingered when I'd ordered them to leave. Oh, and the way they would sometimes appear when I didn't want them to. I was busy with some final touches on the girl figure, and wasn't even looking at Marta, when suddenly I knew the things were there. Well, the smell told me. If nothing else, I guess you know what that smell is like. I looked up and found the studio was full of them. They'd never before appeared in such numbers. Well, they were surrounding Marta, they were crowding and jostling each other, all reaching toward her with their filthy talons. But even then, I didn't think they could harm her. Well, they are material beings in the sense that we are. They really have no physical power outside their own plane. All that they do have is, well, a sort of snaky mesmerism. They'll always try to drag you down to their own dimension by means of it. God help anyone who yields to them, but you don't have to go unless you're weak or willing. I've never had any doubt of my power to resist them, and I didn't really dream they could do anything to Marta. Oh, it startled me, though, when I saw the whole crowd in Hellpack, and I ordered them to go pretty sharply. I was angry, and somewhat alarmed, too, but they merely grimaced and slavered with that slow, twisting movement of their lips that's like a voiceless gibbering, and then they closed in on Marta, just as I represented them doing in that accursed group of sculpture. Only there were scores of them now, instead of merely 7. I can't describe how it happened, but all at once their foul talons had reached the girl. They were pawing her, were pulling at her hands, her arms, her body. She screamed, and I hope I'll never hear another scream so full of black agony and soul-unhinging fright. Then I knew that she'd yielded to them, either by choice or from excessive terror, and I knew that they were taking her away. For a moment the studio wasn't there at all, only a long, grey, oozing plain, beneath skies that were the fumes of hell, writhing like a million ghostly and distorted dragons. Marta was sinking into that ooze, and the things were all about her, gathering in fresh hundreds from every side, fighting each other for place, sinking with her like bloated, misshaped fang creatures into their native slime. And then everything vanished, and I was standing here in the studio, all alone with these damn sculptures. He paused for a little, and then stared with dreary, desolate eyes at the floor. And then, it was awful, Philip, and I'll never forgive myself for having anything to do with those monsters.
I must have been a little mad, but I've always had a strong ambition to create some real stuff in the field of the grotesque and visionary and macabre. I don't suppose you ever suspected, back in my stodgy phase, that I had a veritable appetence for such things. I wanted to do in sculpture what Poe and Lovecraft and Baudelaire have done in literature, what Robson Goya did in pictorial art. And this was what led me into the occult. When I realized my limitations, I knew that I had to see the dwellers of the invisible worlds before I could depict them. I wanted to do it. I longed for this power of vision and representation more than anything else. And then, all at once, I found that I had the power of summoning the unseen. There was no magic involved, in the usual sense of the word. No spells and circles, no pentacles and burning gums from old sorcery books. At bottom, it was just willpower, I guess. A will to divine the satanic, to summon the innumerable malignites and grotesqueries of people from other planes than ours, or mingled unperceived with humanity. You have no idea what I've beheld, Philip. These statues of mine, these devils, vampires, lamias, satyrs, were all done from life, or at least from recent memory. The originals are what the occultists would call elementals, I suppose. There are endless worlds, contiguous to our own, or coexisting with it, that such beings inhabit. All the creations of myth and fantasy, all the familiar spirits that sorcerers have evoked, are resident in these worlds. And I made myself their master. I levied upon them at will. Then, from a dimension that must be a little lower than all others, a little nearer the ultimate nadir of hell, I called the innominate beings who posed for this new figure piece. I don't know who they are, but I have surmised a good deal. They are hateful as the worms of the pit. They are malevolent as harpies. They drool with a poisonous hunger not to be named or imagined. But I believe they were powerless to do anything outside their own sphere, and I've always laughed at them when they try to entice me, even though that snakish metal pull of theirs was rather creepy at times. It was as if soft, invisible, gelatinous arms were trying to drag you down from the firm shore into a bottomless bog. Oh, they are hunters, I am sure of that. Hunters from beyond. God knows what they'll do to Marta now they have her at their mercy. Oh, that vast, viscid, miasma-haunted place to which they took her is awful beyond the imagining of Satan. Perhaps even there they couldn't harm her body, but bodies aren't what they want. It isn't for human flesh that they grope with those ghoulish claws, and gape and slaver with those gangrenous mouths. The brain itself, and the soul, too, is their food. They are the creatures who prey on the minds of madmen and madwomen, who devour the disembodied spirits that have fallen from the cycles of incarnation, have gone down beyond the possibility of rebirth. Oh, to think of Marta in their power. It is worse than hell or madness. Marta loved me, I loved her too, though I didn't have the sense to realize it, wrapped as I was in my dark, baleful ambition and impious egotism. She was afraid for me, and I believe she surrendered voluntarily to the things. She must have thought they'd leave me alone if they secured another victim in my place. He ceased, and began to pace idly and feverishly about. I saw that his hollow eyes were alight with torment, as if the mechanical telling of this horrible story had in some manner served to re-quicken his crushed mind. Utterly and starkly appalled by his hideous revelations, I could say nothing, but could only stand and watch his torture-twisted face. Incredibly, his expression changed, with a wild, startled look that was instantly transfigured into joy. Turning to follow his gaze, I saw that Marta was standing in the center of the room. She was nude, apart from a Spanish shawl that she must have worn while posing. Her face was bloodless as the marble of a tomb, and her eyes were wide and blank as if she'd been drained of all life, of all thought or emotion or memory, as if even the knowledge of horror had been taken away from her. It was the face of the living dead, and the soulless mask of ultimate idiocy, and the joy faded from Cyprian's eyes as he stepped toward her. He took her in his arms. He spoke to her with a desperate, loving tenderness, with cajoling and caressing words. She made no answer, however, no movement of recognition or awareness, but stared beyond him with her blank eyes, to which the daylight and the darkness, the void air and her lover's face, would henceforward be the same. He and I both knew, in that instant, that she would never again respond to any human voice, or to human love or terror, that she was like an empty cerement, retaining the outward form of that which the worms have eaten in their mausolean darkness, of the noisome pits wherein she'd been, of that bournless realm and its pullulating phantoms. She could tell us nothing. Her agony had ended with the terrible mercy of complete forgetfulness. Like one who confronts the Gorgon, I was frozen by her wide and sightless gaze. Then, behind her, where stood an array of carved Satans and Lamias, the room seemed to recede. The walls and floors dissolved into a seething, unfathomable gulf, amid whose pestilential vapours the statues were mingled in momentary and loathsome ambiguity with the ravening faces, the hunger-contorted forms that swirled toward us from their ultra-dimensional limbo, like a devil-laden hurricane from the Malabulge. Outlined against that boiling, measureless cauldron of malignant storm, Marta stood like an image of glacial death and silence in the arms of Cyprian. Then, once more, after a little, the abhorrent vision faded, leaving only the diabolic statuette. I like to think that I alone beheld it, that Cyprian had seen nothing but the dead face of Marta. He drew her close. He repeated his hopeless words of tenderness and cajolery, and then, suddenly, he released her with a vehement sob of despair. Turning away, while she stood and still looked on with unseeing eyes, he snatched a heavy sculptor's mallet from the table on which it was lying, and proceeded to smash with furious blows the newly modelled group of gargoyles, till nothing was left but the figure of the terror-maddened girl, crouching above a mass of cloddish fragments and formless, half-dried clay. Two men stood in the billiard room of an old country house, talking. Play, which had been of a half-hearted nature, was over, and they sat down at the open window, looking out over the park stretching away beneath them, conversing idly. "Your time's nearly up, Jem," said one at length. "This time 6 weeks you'll be yawning out of the honeymoon and cursing the woman, who invented them." Jem Benson stretched his long limbs in the chair and grunted in dissent. "I've never understood it," continued Wilfred Carr, yawning. "It's not in my line at all. I never had money enough for my own wants, let alone for two. Perhaps if I were as rich as you or Croesus, I might regard it differently." There was sufficient meaning in the latter part of the remark for his cousin to forbear to reply to it. He continued to gaze out of the window and to smoke slowly. "Not being as rich as Croesus or you," resumed Carr, regarding him from beneath lowered lids, "I paddle my own canoe down the stream of time, and, tying it to my friends' doorposts, go in to eat their dinners." "Quite Venetian," said Jem Benson, still looking out of the window. "It's not a bad thing for you, Wilfred, that you have the doorposts and dinners and, friends." Carr grunted in his turn. "Seriously, though, Jem," he said slowly, "you're a lucky fellow, a very lucky fellow. If there's a better girl above ground than Olive, I should like to see her." "Yes," said the other quietly. "Well, she's an exceptional girl," continued Carr, staring out of the window. "She's so good and gentle. She thinks you are a bundle of all the virtues." He laughed frankly and joyously, but the other man did not join him. "Strong sense of right and wrong, though. continued Carr musingly. "Do you know, I believe that if she found out what you were not..." "Not what?" demanded Benson, turning upon him fiercely.
"Not what?"
"Everything that you are," returned his cousin with a grin that belied his words. "Well, I believe she'd drop you." "Talk about something else," said Benson slowly. "Your pleasantries are not always in the best taste." Wilfred Carr rose and, taking a cue from the rack, bent over the board and practiced one or two favourite shots.
"The only other subject I can talk about just at present is my own financial affairs," he said slowly, as he walked round the table.
"Talk about something else," Benson said again, bluntly.
"And the two things are connected,"
said Carr. Dropping his cue, he half sat on the table and eyed his cousin. There was a long silence. Benson pitched the end of his cigar out of the window and, leaning back, closed his eyes.
"Do you, follow me?"
inquired Carr at length. Benson opened his eyes and nodded at the window. "Do you want to follow my cigar?" he demanded.
"I should prefer to depart by the usual way for your sake,"
returned the other, unabashed. "If I left by the window, all sorts of questions would be asked, and you know how talkative a chap I am." "Oh, so long as you don't talk about my affairs," returned the other, restraining himself by an obvious effort. "You can talk yourself hoarse."
"I'm in a mess," said Carr slowly. "A devil of a mess. If I don't raise 1,500 by this day fortnight, I may be getting my board and lodging free."
"Would that be any change?" questioned Benson.
"The quality would," retorted the other. "The address would also not be good. Seriously, Jem, will you let me have the 1,500?
"No," said the other simply. Carr went white.
"It's to save me from ruin,"
he said thickly. "I've helped you till I'm tired," said Benson, turning and regarding him, "and it is all to no good. If you've got into a mess, get out of it. You should not be so fond of giving autographs away."
"Yeah, it's foolish, I admit," said Carr deliberately. "I won't do so any more. By the way, I've got some to sell. You needn't sneer, they're not my own."
"Whose are they?" inquired the other.
Yours."
Benson got up from his chair and crossed over to him. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "Blackmail?"
"Call it what you like,"
said Carr.
"I've got some letters for sale. Price 1,500. And I know a man who would buy them at that price for the mere chance of getting Olive from you.
Well, I'll give you first offer. If you've got any letters bearing my signature, you'll be good enough to give them to me," said Benson very slowly.
"They're mine," said Carr lightly. "Given to me by the lady you wrote them to. I must say they are not all in the best possible taste."
His cousin reached forward suddenly and, catching him by the collar of his coat, pinned him down on the table.
"Give me those letters,"
he breathed, sticking his face close to Carr's.
"They're not here," said Carr, struggling. "I'm not a fool. Let me go or I'll raise the price."
The other man raised him from the table in his powerful hands, apparently with the intention of dashing his head against it. Then suddenly his hold relaxed as an astonished-looking maidservant entered the room with letters. Carr sat up hastily.
"That's how it was done,"
said Benson, for the girl's benefit, as he took the letters.
"I don't wonder at the other man making him pay for it, then,"
said Carr blandly. "You will give me those letters?" asked Benson suggestively as the girl left the room.
At the price I mentioned, yes," said Carr. "But so sure as I am a living man, if you lay your clumsy hands on me again, I'll double it. Now, I'll leave you for a time while you think it over."
He took a cigar from the box and, lighting it carefully, quitted the room. His cousin waited until the door had closed behind him and then, turning to the window, sat there in a fit of fury, as silent as it was terrible. The air was fresh and sweet from the park, heavy with the scent of new-mown grass. The fragrance of a cigar was now added to it, and glancing out he saw his cousin pacing slowly by. He rose and went to the door, and then, apparently altering his mind, he returned to the window and watched the figure of his cousin as it moved slowly away into the moonlight. Then he rose again, and, for a long time, the room was empty. It was empty when Mrs. Benson came in some time later to say good night to her son on her way to bed. She walked slowly round the table and, pausing at the window, gazed from it in idle thought, until she saw the figure of her son advancing rapid strides toward the house. He looked up at the window. "Good night," said she. "Good night," said Benson in a deep voice. "Where's Wilfred?" "Oh, he's gone," said Benson. "Gone?" "We had a few words. He was wanting money again, and I gave him a piece of my mind. I don't think we shall see him again." "Oh, poor Wilfred," sighed Mrs. Benson. "He's always in trouble of some sort. I hope that you weren't too hard upon him." "No more than he deserved," said her son sternly. "Good night." The well, which had long ago fallen into disuse, was almost hidden by the thick tangle of undergrowth which ran riot at the corner of the old park. It was partly covered by the shrunken half of a lid, above which a rusty windlass creaked in company with the music of the pines when the wind blew strongly. The full light of the sun never reached it, and the ground surrounding it was moist and green when other parts of the park were gaping with the heat. Two people walking slowly round the park in the fragrant stillness of a summer evening strayed in the direction of the well. "Oh, no use going through this wilderness, Olive," said Benson, pausing on the outskirts of the pines and eyeing with some disfavour the gloom beyond. "Best part of the park," said the girl briskly. "Oh, you know it's my favourite spot." "I know you're very fond of sitting on the coping," said the man slowly, "and I wish you wouldn't. One day you'll lean back too far and fall in." "And then make the acquaintance of truth," said Olive lightly. "Come along." She ran from him and was lost in the shadow of the pines, the bracken crackling beneath her as her feet ran across it. Her companion followed slowly, and, emerging from the gloom, saw her poised daintily on the edge of the well, with her feet hidden in the rank grass and nettles which surrounded it. She motioned her companion to take a seat by her side, and smiled softly as she felt a strong arm passed around her waist. "Oh, I like this place," said she, breaking a long silence. "It is so dismal, so uncanny. Do you know, I wouldn't dare sit there alone, Jem. I should imagine all sorts of dreadful things were hidden beneath those bushes and trees, waiting to spring out on me. Oh!" "Well, you'd better let me take you in," said her companion tenderly. "The well isn't always wholesome, especially in the hot weather. Let's make a move." The girl gave an obstinate little shake and settled herself more securely on her seat. "Oh, smoke your cigar in peace," she said quietly. "I'm settled here for a quiet talk. Oh, has anything heard of Wilfred yet?" Nothing." "Oh, quite a dramatic disappearance, isn't it?" she continued. "Another scrape, I suppose, and another letter for you in the same old strain. Oh, dear Jem, help me out." Jem Benson blew a cloud of fragrant smoke into the air, and holding his cigar between his teeth, brushed away the ash from his coat sleeves. "I wonder what he would have done without you," said the girl, pressing his arm affectionately. "Gone under long ago, I suppose. When we're married, Jem, I'll presume upon the relationship to lecture him. He is very wild, but he has his good points, the poor fellow." "I never saw them," said Benson with startling bitterness. "God knows I never saw them." "Well, he's nobody's enemy but his own," said the girl, startled by his outburst. You don't know much about him, said the other sharply. He was not above blackmail, not above ruining the life of a friend to do himself a benefit. A loafer, a cur and a liar. The girl looked at him soberly but timidly and took his arm without a word, and they both sat silent while evening deepened into night, and the beams of the moon, filtering through the branches, surrounded them with a silver network. Her head sank upon his shoulder, till suddenly, with a sharp cry, she sprang to her feet.
What was that?
She cried breathlessly.
What was what?
Demanded Benson, springing up and clutching her fast by the arm. She caught her breath and tried to laugh.
You're hurting me, Jem.
His hold relaxed.
What is the matter?
He asked gently. What was it that startled you?
I was startled,
she said slowly, putting her hands on his shoulder.
I suppose the words I used just now were ringing in my ears, but I fancied that someone behind us whispered, Jem, help me out.
Fancy, repeated Benson, and his voice shook.
But these fancies are not good for you. You are frightened at the dark and the gloom of these trees. Let me take you back to the house. No, I'm not frightened, said the girl, reseating herself. I should never be really frightened of anything when you were with me, Jem. I'm surprised at myself for being so silly.
The man made no reply but stood, a strong, dark figure, a yard or two from the well, as though waiting for her to join him.
Come and sit down, sir,
cried Olive, patting the brickwork with her small white hand. One would think you didn't like your company. He obeyed slowly and took a seat by her side, drawing so hard at his cigar that the light of it shone upon his fare at every breath. He passed his arm, firm and rigid as steel, behind her, with his hand resting on the brickwork beyond.
Are you warm enough?
He asked tenderly, as she made a little movement.
Pretty fair, she shivered. One oughtn't to be cold at this time of year. There's a cold, damp air comes up from that well.
As she spoke, a faint splash sounded from the depths below, and for the second time that evening she sprang from the well with a little cry of dismay.
What is it now?
He asked in a fearful voice. He stood by her side and gazed at the well, as though half expecting to see the cause of her alarm emerge from it.
Oh, my bracelet,
she cried in distress.
My poor mother's bracelet. I've dropped it down the well.
Your bracelet, repeated Benson dully.
Your bracelet, the diamond one. Oh, that was my mother's, said Olive. Oh, we can't get it back, surely. Look, we must have the water drained off.
Your bracelet, repeated Benson stupidly.
Jem,
said the girl in terrified tones.
Dear Jem, what's the matter?
For the man she loved was standing, regarding her with horror. The moon which touched it was not responsible for all the whiteness of the distorted face, and she shrank back in fear to the edge of the well. He saw her fear and, by a mighty effort, regained his composure and took her hand.
Poor little girl, he murmured. You frightened me. I was not looking when you cried, and I thought that you were slipping from my arms. Down, down.
His voice broke, and the girl, throwing herself into his arms, clung to him convulsively.
There,
said Benson fondly. Don't cry, don't cry.
Tomorrow,
said Olive, half laughing, half crying.
We'll all come round the well with hook and line and fish for it. It'll be quite a new sport.
No, we must try some other way, said Benson. You shall have it back.
How?
asked the girl.
You shall see, said Benson.
Tomorrow morning, at latest, you shall have it back. Till then, promise me that you will not mention your loss to anyone. Promise?
I promise,
said Olive, wonderingly.
But why not?
Well, it is of great value, for one thing. Well, there are many reasons. For one thing, it is my duty to get it for you.
Wouldn't you like to jump down for it?
she asked mischievously.
Listen.
She stooped for a stone and dropped it down.
Fancy being where that is now,
she said, peering into the blackness.
Fancy going round and round like a mouse in a pail, clutching at the slimy sides, with the water filling your mouth, and looking up to the little patch of sky above.
You'd better come in, said Benson very quietly. You're developing a taste for the morbid and horrible. The girl turned and, taking his arm, walked slowly in the direction of the house. Mrs. Benson, who was sitting in the porch, rose to receive them.
Oh, you shouldn't have kept her out so long,
she said chidingly.
Where have you been?
Oh, sitting on the well, said Olive, smiling, discussing our future.
I don't believe that place is healthy, said Mrs. Benson emphatically. I really think it might be filled in, Jem.
All right, said her son slowly. Pity it wasn't filled in long ago. He took the chair vacated by his mother as she entered the house with Olive, and with his hands hanging limply over the sides, sat in deep thought. After a time he rose, and going upstairs to a room which was set apart for sporting requisites, selected a sea fishing line and some hooks, and stole softly downstairs again. He walked swiftly across the park in the direction of the well, turning before he entered the shadow of the trees to look back at the lighted windows of the house. Then, having arranged his line, he sat on the edge of the well and cautiously lowered it. He sat with his lips compressed, occasionally looking about him in a startled fashion, as though he half expected to see something peering at him from the belt of trees. Time after time he lowered his line until at length, in pulling it up, he heard a little metallic tinkle against the side of the well. He held his breath then, and forgetting his fears, drew the line in inch by inch, so as not to lose its precious burden. His pulse beat rapidly, and his eyes were bright. As the line came slowly in, he saw the catch hanging to the hook, and with a steady hand drew the last few feet in. And then he saw that, instead of the bracelet, he'd hooked a bunch of keys. With a faint cry, he shook them from the hook into the water below, and stood breathing heavily. Not a sound broke the stillness of the night. He walked up and down a bit and stretched his great muscles. Then he came back to the well and resumed his task. For an hour or more the line was lowered without result. In his eagerness he forgot his fears, and with eyes bent down the well, fished slowly and carefully. Twice the hook became entangled in something, and was with difficulty released. It caught a third time, and all his efforts failed to free it. Then he dropped the line down the well and, with head bent, walked back toward the house. He went first to the stables at the rear, and then, retiring to his room for some time, paced restlessly up and down. Then, without removing his clothes, he flung himself upon the bed and fell into a troubled sleep. Long before anybody else was astir, he arose and stole softly downstairs. The sunlight was stealing in at every crevice and flashing in long streaks across the darkened rooms. The dining room into which he looked struck chill and cheerless in the dark yellow light which came through the lowered blinds. He remembered that it had been the same appearance when his father had laid dead in the house. Now, as then, everything seemed ghastly and unreal. The very chairs standing as their occupants had left them the night before seemed to be indulging in some dark communication of ideas. Slowly and noiselessly he opened the hall door and passed into the fragrant air beyond. The sun was shining on the drenched grass and trees, and slowly vanishing white mist rolled like smoke about the grounds. For a moment he stood, breathing deeply the sweet air of the morning, and then walked slowly in the direction of the stables. The rusty creaking of a pump handle and a spatter of water upon the red-tiled courtyard showed that someone else was astir, and a few steps farther he beheld a brawny, sandy-haired man gasping wildly under severe self-infliction at the pump.
"Everything ready, George?"
he asked quietly.
"Oh, yes, sir,"
said the man, straightening up suddenly and touching his forehead.
"Bob's just finishing the arrangements inside. It's a lovely morning for a dip. Oh, that water in the well must be just icy."
"I'll be as quick as you can," said Benson impatiently.
"Aye, very good, sir,"
said George, burnishing his face harshly with a very small towel which had been hanging over the top of the pump.
"Oi, hurry up, Bob."
In answer to his summons, a man appeared at the door of the stable with a coil of stout rope over his arm and a large metal candlestick in his hand.
"Just to try the air, sir,"
said George, following his master's glance.
"Oh, a well gets rather foul sometimes, but if a candle can live down it, then a man can too."
His master nodded, and the man, hastily pulling up the neck of his shirt and thrusting his arms into his coat, followed him as he led the way slowly to the well.
"Beg pardon, sir,"
said George, drawing up to his side,
"but you are not looking over and above well this morning. If you let me go down, I'd enjoy the bath."
No, said Benson peremptorily.
"You ain't fit to go down, sir," persisted his follower. "I've never seen you look so before. Now, if—"
"Mind your business," said his master curtly. Oh, George became silent, and the three walked with swinging strides through the long wet grass to the well. Bob flung the rope on the ground, and at a sign from his master handed him the candlestick.
"Oh, here's the line for it, sir,"
said Bob, fumbling in his pockets. Benson took it from him and slowly tied it to the candlestick. Then he placed it on the edge of the well and, striking a match, lit the candle and began to slowly lower it.
"Hold hard, sir,"
said George quickly, laying his hand on his arm.
"You must tilt it or the string will burn through."
Even as he spoke, the string parted and the candlestick fell into the water below. Benson swore quietly.
"I'll soon get another,"
said George, starting up. "Never mind. Look, the well's all right," said Benson.
"It won't take a moment, sir,"
said the other over his shoulder. "Look, are you the master here, or am I?" said Benson hoarsely. George came back slowly, a glance at his master's face stopping the protest upon his tongue, and he stood by watching him sulkily as he sat on the well and removed his outer garments. Both men watched him curiously, as having completed his preparations, he stood grim and silent, with his hands by his sides.
"Oh, I wish you'd let me go, sir,"
said George, plucking up courage to address him.
"You ain't fit to go. You've got a chill or something. I shouldn't wonder it's the typhoid. Oh, they've got it in the village bad."
For a moment Benson looked at him angrily, and then his gaze softened.
"Not this time, George,"
he said quietly. He took the looped end of the rope and placed it under his arms, and sitting down threw one leg over the side of the well.
"How are you going to go about it, sir?"
queried George, laying hold of the rope and signing to Bob to do the same. "I'll call out when I reach the water," said Benson, "then pay out 3 yards more quickly so that I can get to the bottom."
"Aye, very good, sir,"
answered both. Their master threw the other leg over the coping and sat motionless. His back was turned toward the men as he sat with head bent, looking down the shaft. He sat for so long that George became uneasy.
"All right, sir?"
he inquired. "Yes," said Benson slowly. "If I tug at the rope, George, pull up at once. Right, lower away." The rope passed steadily through their hands until a hollow cry from the darkness below and a faint splashing warned them that he'd reached the water. They gave him 3 yards more and stood with a relaxed grasp and strained ears, waiting.
"Oh, he's gone under,"
said Bob in a low voice. The other nodded and, moistening his huge palms, took a firmer grip of the rope. Fully a minute passed, and the men began to exchange uneasy glances. And then a sudden tremendous jerk, followed by a series of feebler ones, nearly tore the rope from their grasp.
"Pull,"
said George, placing one foot on the side and hauling desperately.
"Pull. Pull! He's stuck fast. He's not coming. Pull!
In response to their terrific exertions, the rope came slowly in, inch by inch, until at length a violent splashing was heard, and at the same moment a scream of unutterable horror came echoing up the shaft.
"Oh, what a weight he is!" panted Bob. "Oh, he's stuck fast or something. Keep still, sir, for heaven's sake, keep still."
For the taut rope was being jerked violently by the struggles of the weight at the end of it. Both men, with grunts and sighs, hauled it in foot by foot.
"All right, sir,"
cried George cheerfully. He had one foot against the well and was pulling manfully. The burden was nearing the top. A long pull and a strong pull, and the face of a dead man with mud in his eyes and nostrils came peering over the edge. Behind it was the ghastly face of his master. But this he saw too late, for with a great cry he let go of his hold of the rope and stepped back. The suddenness overthrew his assistant, and the rope tore through his hands. And there was a frightful splash.
"Oh, you fool!"
stammered Bob, and ran to the well helplessly.
"God, run!" cried George. "Run for another line!"
He bent over the coping and called eagerly down as his assistant sped back to the stable, shouting wildly. His voice re-echoed down the shaft, but all else was silence. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.